Maulana Jalal ad-Din Balkhi, known as Rumi, was born in 1207 into a Persian family in Balkh, in what is now Afghanistan. He became one of the most influential spiritual thinkers in human history. Yet most people today know only his poetry stripped of its radical theological framework, reduced to greeting card wisdom about love and soulmates. This represents a profound misunderstanding. Rumi was not writing self-help literature. He articulated a complete metaphysical system within 13th century Islamic mysticism, specifically the Mevlevi order of Sufism, that challenged conventional religious practice, redefined human purpose, and proposed a controversial path to experiencing the divine directly. To understand Rumi's actual philosophy, we must reconstruct the intellectual world he inhabited. He lived during the Mongol invasions that devastated the Islamic world, killing millions and destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge. His family fled westward when he was young, eventually settling in Konya in present-day Turkey. This context of upheaval and loss permeates his work, which he composed in Persian. Rumi received traditional Islamic education, studying jurisprudence and theology, and was set to become a conventional religious scholar until his transformative encounter with Shams of Tabriz, a wandering dervish, in 1244. This meeting catalyzed Rumi's evolution from orthodox scholar to mystical poet-philosopher. What emerged was a systematic reinterpretation of existence. His ideas challenged the religious establishment, proposed that direct divine experience supersedes scriptural knowledge, and suggested that conventional piety might actually obstruct spiritual realization. These were dangerous propositions in medieval Islamic society. This analysis will examine Rumi's complete philosophical system. We will explore where his ideas succeed, where they fail, how scholars debate his legacy, and what happens when we apply his thinking to concrete human situations. We will not sanitize his contradictions or ignore his limitations. Part 1. The Foundational Metaphysics, Reality as Divine Manifestation. Rumi's entire philosophical system rests on a single radical premise. Everything that exists is God in disguise. This is not pantheism, the idea that nature itself is divine. Rather, Rumi articulates what Islamic philosophers call wahdat al-wujud, the unity of existence, though this term was formalized by his older contemporary Ibn Arabi. The concept proposes that only God possesses true existence, and everything we perceive as separate and material is actually God's self-manifestation, like countless waves that appear distinct but are all the same ocean. This sounds abstract, so let us make it concrete. When you look at another person, Rumi insists you are looking at God wearing a human mask. When you feel anger, that emotion is divine energy taking the form of anger. When you experience loneliness, that is God experiencing loneliness through you. There is no moment when you are not in direct contact with the divine, because there is nothing else that exists. The separation you feel is perceptual illusion, not metaphysical reality. Why does this matter? Because, if true, it revolutionizes ethics, purpose, and spiritual practice. If you harm another person, you are literally God harming God. If you seek God in heaven or in holy buildings, you are looking in the wrong place, because God is precisely where you already are. The entire project of religion transforms from following rules to gain divine favor into recognizing what has always been true. Rumi illustrates this through his famous reed flute metaphor. The reed flute moans because it was cut from the reed bed. It remembers its source and laments the separation. But here is the crucial insight most interpreters miss. The separation is not ontological, meaning it does not exist in the nature of things. The reed was never actually separate from the reed bed in essence, only in form. The flute's music is the reed bed singing through the flute. Similarly, your consciousness is God experiencing existence through your particular form. This creates an immediate philosophical problem that Rumi never fully resolves. If only God exists, what is sin? What is evil? If a murderer is God manifesting as a murderer and the victim is God manifesting as a victim, does this not eliminate moral responsibility? Rumi's response is subtle but ultimately unsatisfying to many scholars. He argues that evil exists within the dream of separation, the illusion that things are independent. Once you realize unity, evil becomes impossible because you cannot truly harm what you recognize as yourself. But this seems to make ethics contingent on enlightenment, which is deeply problematic. Let us examine a concrete application. A physician in 13th century Konya faces a patient dying of plague. Conventional Islamic theology says this is God's will, accept it, focus on the afterlife. Rumi's metaphysics suggests something different. The doctor, the patient, the disease, and the potential cure are all God in different forms. The doctor's compassion is God's compassion. The effort to heal is God attempting to heal God. This framework validates passionate engagement with the world, not just passive acceptance. It sacralizes medicine, not as interfering with divine will, but as participating in divine creative activity. But notice the trap. If the patient dies despite treatment, is that also God's perfect manifestation? Rumi would say yes. Then what distinguishes his view from fatalism, the idea that we should not try to change anything? Rumi argues that trying itself is divine. The effort matters regardless of outcome. But critics point out this can justify either radical activism or complete passivity, depending on interpretation. Scholarly debates about Rumi's metaphysics center on whether he actually believed in complete unity or retained some notion of creation as distinct from the creator. Orthodox Islamic theology maintains that God is utterly transcendent, wholly other than creation. Wahdat al-Wujud blurs or eliminates this distinction. Some Rumi scholars, particularly traditional Muslim scholars, argue his poetry uses unity language metaphorically while preserving orthodox theology underneath. Others, particularly Western academics and Sufi practitioners, insist he genuinely advocates for experiential unity, where distinction between self and God dissolves completely. The textual evidence supports the radical interpretation. In the Masnavi, his 6-volume masterwork of spiritual teaching stories, Rumi explicitly states that advanced mystics move beyond seeing creation as separate from God. He describes stages where the seeker first relates to God as other, then as beloved, then realizes the seeker and sought are identical. This progression is incompatible with maintaining absolute transcendence. Where does this metaphysics fail? First, it struggles to account for genuine novelty or freedom. If everything is predetermined divine manifestation, in what sense do your choices matter? Rumi tries to preserve human agency by arguing that within the dream of separation, choices are real and consequential. But this feels like having it both ways. Either your decisions are genuinely free, or they are predetermined divine unfolding. Calling them free within an illusion does not resolve the contradiction. Second, the framework can enable spiritual bypassing, using metaphysical concepts to avoid dealing with psychological or social problems. If suffering is just God experiencing suffering through you, and all experiences are equally divine, this can discourage addressing injustice or trauma. Modern Rumi enthusiasts sometimes use his poetry to avoid uncomfortable emotions or difficult relationships, claiming everything is perfect as it is. This represents a failure to grapple with Rumi's actual teaching, which insists on deep emotional honesty and transformation, not avoidance disguised as acceptance. Third, Rumi's metaphysics has limited explanatory power for specific natural phenomena. It offers no mechanism for understanding why the divine manifests as galaxies versus flowers versus consciousness. It is a unifying framework, not a detailed theory. This makes it powerful for meaning-making, but weak for prediction or precise understanding. The contemporary philosopher Ken Wilber attempts to salvage Rumi's insight by distinguishing between absolute and relative perspectives. From the absolute view, only undifferentiated divine reality exists. From the relative view, the entire world of form, cause and effect, ethics and choices matters completely. Both are simultaneously true from different vantage points. Whether Rumi himself would accept this framing remains debatable, but it represents how modern thinkers try to preserve his insight while addressing its limitations. Part 2. The Theology of Love, Beyond Romance to Cosmic Force. Most people encounter Rumi through decontextualized quotes about love that sound like romantic poetry. This represents perhaps the greatest distortion of his thought. When Rumi speaks of love, he is not discussing human romantic relationships, though he does not exclude them. He is describing the fundamental force that drives the universe, the engine of all transformation, and the method by which God knows God. In Rumi's framework, love is not an emotion. It is ontological gravity, the force that pulls all manifestations back toward their source. Just as physical objects fall toward Earth due to gravity, all beings are pulled toward reunion with the divine through love. But this is not passive attraction. Love is active, violent, and destructive to the false self. It annihilates everything that pretends to exist independently. Consider Rumi's frequent fire metaphors. Love is the flame that burns away everything that is not God. When you love truly, in Rumi's sense, you are not adding something beautiful to your life. You are setting fire to your carefully constructed identity. The lover must die into the beloved. This death is not metaphorical comfort, it is experiential terror. Here is where modern readers fundamentally misunderstand Rumi. They read his ecstatic poetry about union with the beloved and imagine a blissful, affirming experience. But Rumi describes love's path as including humiliation, madness, social rejection, and the complete collapse of rational control. In one famous passage, he says, "True lovers appear insane to ordinary people because they have sacrificed sanity itself on love's altar." The concrete mechanics work like this. You begin by loving particular things or people. A child loves their mother. A young adult falls in love with another person. These specific attachments are not mistakes to overcome. They are necessary training. Through loving specific forms, you learn what love feels like, how it motivates action, how it breaks open your defended heart. But remaining stuck at particular love is incomplete. Rumi argues that as love deepens, it begins burning through its own object. You love a person so completely that you start loving what lies beyond their particular form, the divine essence animating them. Then love spreads. You begin loving other people, other beings, other forms. Eventually, if the process completes, you love existence itself without preference or discrimination. This is universal love, loving the source that manifests as all things. Rumi's relationship with Shams of Tabriz exemplifies this progression in devastating detail. When they met, Rumi was 47, an established scholar with students and social position. Shams was an itinerant mystic who challenged everything Rumi thought he knew. Rumi fell into obsessive love, abandoning his teaching duties, ignoring his family, spending every moment with Shams. His students and family were scandalized. This was not dignified spiritual friendship. This was unhinged devotion that destroyed Rumi's social standing. Then Shams disappeared, possibly murdered by Rumi's jealous son. Rumi's grief was so total that he stopped distinguishing between himself and Shams. He began signing Shams's name to his own poetry. He claimed Shams still spoke through him. Critics call this psychological breakdown or unhealthy attachment. Rumi calls it love's completion, where the lover dissolves so completely that only the beloved remains. This reveals the dangerous edge of Rumi's love theology. He appears to valorize losing yourself in another, which contemporary psychology recognizes as codependency or fusion. The difference, Rumi argues, is the direction of dissolution. Losing yourself in another person's ego is pathology. Losing yourself in the divine reality underlying that person is liberation. But how do you distinguish between these in actual experience, especially when emotion overwhelms clarity? Scholarly debates center on whether Rumi advocates for literal or metaphorical annihilation of self. The Arabic term is fana, extinction or passing away. Some scholars argue this means the ego or false self dies while essential personhood remains, transformed. Others insist Rumi describes complete dissolution where individual consciousness ceases entirely, merging into undifferentiated divine awareness. The textual evidence suggests Rumi holds both simultaneously, which seems contradictory. In some passages, the lover disappears completely, no trace remaining. In others, the purified lover persists but functions as transparent vessel for divine action. This may reflect different stages of realization or Rumi's own uncertainty about the ultimate nature of consciousness. Where does love theology fail in practice? First, it can justify remaining in abusive relationships by framing suffering as spiritual purification. If love requires enduring humiliation and destruction of self, how do you distinguish transformative spiritual crisis from destructive psychological harm? Rumi provides no clear guidelines. He assumes the beloved is divine or represents divinity. But what if you mistake ego projection or predatory behavior for divine challenge? Second, Rumi's framework de-emphasizes consent and boundaries. When love strikes, you surrender completely. This works metaphorically for divine relationship, but becomes problematic in human interaction. Modern Rumi enthusiasts sometimes use his poetry to pressure partners into unhealthy vulnerability, claiming resistance to surrender indicates spiritual failure. Third, the theology struggles with gradation and discernment. If all love is ultimately divine love finding its way home, what distinguishes healthy from unhealthy attachment? Rumi acknowledges that false love exists, loving the prison of ego rather than the liberation of unity. But his criteria for distinguishing true from false love rely on subjective experience of expansion versus contraction, which can be manipulated or misinterpreted. The contemporary philosopher Martha Nussbaum critiques Sufi love theology generally, including Rumi's version, for romanticizing suffering and loss. She argues this reflects historical conditions where people had limited control over their circumstances, so they developed philosophies that made suffering meaningful. In contexts where you can actually reduce suffering through social change or therapy, choosing suffering for spiritual reasons may reflect failure of imagination rather than deep wisdom. However, psychologists studying post-traumatic growth find something valuable in Rumi's framework. People who survive major loss or trauma often report that forced surrender of control, accepting what cannot be changed, opens unexpected capacity for presence and compassion. Rumi's poetry provides language for this transformation that clinical terminology cannot capture. The question becomes when surrender enables healing versus when it enables avoidance of necessary action. Rumi also develops a theology of divine love that differs from mainstream Islamic teaching. Orthodox theology presents God as loving, but also just, wrathful, and transcendent. Rumi emphasizes almost exclusively divine love to the point where other attributes fade into background. God becomes essentially love itself, not a being who chooses to love. This creates theological tension with Quranic passages describing divine judgment and hellfire. Rumi addresses this by suggesting these represent stages of purification, not eternal punishment. Hell is separation from God experienced as torment, but since only God truly exists, this separation cannot be ultimate or permanent. Eventually, all manifestation returns to source through love's irresistible pull. Conservative Islamic scholars throughout history have condemned this near universalism, the idea that eventually everyone achieves salvation. They argue it eliminates moral urgency and contradicts explicit Quranic teaching. Rumi's response, implicit in his work, is that love does not eliminate ethical responsibility, but transforms its motivation from fear to yearning, from punishment avoidance to reunion seeking. The practical application reveals both power and problems. A contemporary person struggling with addiction might encounter Rumi's love theology. The typical reading says, "You are addicted, because you're trying to fill spiritual emptiness with material substitutes. True love, divine love, would satisfy that hunger completely, eliminating addiction. This insight helps some people but fails others catastrophically. It helps when addiction genuinely reflects disconnection from meaning and purpose, when substances or behaviors attempt to shortcut to transcendence. Framing recovery as returning to true love, recognizing divine presence in ordinary life, can motivate profound change. But this framework fails when addiction has neurological or trauma-based components requiring medical and psychological intervention. Suggesting that someone just needs to love God more to overcome chemical dependency reflects dangerous spiritualization of medical conditions. Rumi would likely approve of addressing all levels simultaneously, physical, psychological and spiritual, but his followers sometimes reduce complex problems to single spiritual causes. The deepest critique of Rumi's love theology comes from feminist philosophers who note its gendered structure. The lover is typically coded masculine, active, pursuing. The beloved is feminine, passive, mysterious, withdrawing to test devotion. This reproduces problematic dynamics where women exist primarily as objects of male spiritual aspiration rather than subjects of their own spiritual journey. Rumi does occasionally reverse these roles, and his poetry includes female mystics as teachers and exemplars. But the dominant framework remains hierarchical lover-seeking, elevated beloved, which maps onto gender hierarchies of his time and place. Modern readers must decide whether to reject this aspect, reinterpret it, or accept it as historical limitation within otherwise valuable teaching. Part 3. The Path of Transformation, Spiritual Stages and Practices. Rumi is famous for ecstatic poetry, but less known for his systematic description of the spiritual path. Yet embedded in his stories and verses lies a detailed map of consciousness transformation. He outlines specific stages, practices, obstacles, and signs of progress that constitute one of medieval Sufism's most comprehensive developmental models. The journey begins with restlessness. Rumi insists you cannot start the path through intellectual decision or moral effort alone. Something must wound you, create dissatisfaction with ordinary life so acute that you cannot continue as before. This wound might be loss, betrayal, failure, or existential despair. Without it, you remain comfortably asleep. The wound is grace disguised as disaster. Stage 1 is awakening to separation. You realize you are not home. You experience yourself as fundamentally alienated from your source, lost in a world of forms that cannot satisfy your deepest hunger. This is painful, but necessary. Most people live entire lives without this awakening, remaining identified with their social roles, accomplishments, and surface pleasures. Rumi calls them dead but breathing, functioning but not truly alive. The concrete experience involves periods of intense longing without clear object. You might feel successful externally while internally everything seems hollow. You question your life's direction, your relationships, your beliefs. This often appears as midlife crisis, depression, or sudden loss of meaning. Contemporary psychology might pathologize it, prescribe medication to reduce the discomfort. Rumi insists you must not anesthetize this pain, but follow it deeper. Stage 2 is seeking. Once awakened to separation, you begin searching for reunion. This typically starts with external seeking, looking for teachers, teachings, practices, communities. You might try meditation, prayer, therapy, or various spiritual traditions. Rumi encourages this phase, but warns against two traps. First, collecting teachings intellectually without practicing them, becoming a spiritual tourist rather than actual traveller. Second, attachment to particular forms, believing one teacher or technique is the only true path. The seeking stage requires active effort, what Sufis call striving or struggle. You practice consistently even when unmotivated. You challenge habitual patterns. You choose spiritual development over comfort repeatedly. Rumi compares this to polishing a mirror. Your essential nature is already perfect, like polished copper, but accumulated conditioning covers it like tarnish. Practice removes tarnish gradually through repetition, not adding anything new, but revealing what was always there. Specific practices Rumi emphasizes include remembrance of God, continuously returning awareness to divine presence throughout daily activity. This differs from occasional prayer or meditation. It means washing dishes while aware you are divine reality, washing divine reality, walking while knowing the walker and walked upon are one. Obviously, this is difficult to maintain, but the effort itself transforms consciousness even when you fail repeatedly. Rumi also advocates for sama, the whirling meditation practice that became his order's signature. Participants spin continuously in place, losing normal spatial orientation, entering trance states where ordinary identity dissolves. The physical technique induces altered consciousness, but Rumi insists the internal attitude matters more than external form. You can whirl for hours and just get dizzy, or you can move briefly and pierce through to reality. Stage 3 involves encountering what Rumi calls the commanding self or ego. As practice deepens, you begin seeing how much of what you call I is actually conditioned reaction, social programming, and protective pattern. This recognition is destabilizing. You realize you do not know who you actually are beneath the layers of habit and defense. The concrete experience includes noticing how your mind constantly narrates experience, creating stories about who you are, what things mean, what you need. Meditation reveals thought's incessant chatter. Rumi calls this internal dialogue the veil between you and God. Not the thoughts themselves, but identification with them, believing you are the thinker rather than the awareness in which thinking appears. This stage produces profound disorientation as familiar reference points dissolve. You might question your career, relationships, beliefs about right and wrong. What seemed solid and real reveals itself as construction. Modern psychology calls this ego death, and it can be genuinely frightening. Some people require psychological support to navigate this phase safely. Rumi lived in a culture with established structures for this transition, but contemporary seekers often undergo it alone or with inadequate guidance. Stage 4 is purification through difficulty. Rumi insists the path requires being tested, facing situations that expose your remaining attachments and illusions. These tests are not punishments, but necessary friction that burns away what is false. They might appear as relationship conflicts, financial crisis, illness, or direct challenges from your teacher. The key insight is that you cannot graduate from spiritual kindergarten through good behavior and pleasant experiences alone. Growth requires confronting your shadow, the rejected and denied aspects of yourself. Rumi's stories frequently feature characters who think they are spiritual advanced, but crumble when genuinely tested. The person who remains calm in meditation but explodes in anger at minor frustration has not integrated their practice. Critics point out this theology of necessary suffering can justify abusive teaching relationships and prevent people from leaving harmful situations. Not all difficulty is spiritual growth opportunity. Sometimes suffering indicates you are in the wrong place with wrong people and need to leave immediately, not surrender more deeply. Rumi provides inadequate criteria for distinguishing productive from destructive difficulty. Stage 5 involves glimpses of unity, temporary experiences where separation dissolves. These might occur during intense practice, in nature, through intimacy, or spontaneously. Suddenly, the boundary between self and other becomes transparent. You experience being everything and nothing simultaneously. Time stops mattering. Fear disappears because there is nothing separate to be threatened. Rumi describes these states in ecstatic poetry that becomes nearly incoherent with joy and recognition. But he also warns against two mistakes. First, seeking these experiences as spiritual entertainment, treating them like drugs for consciousness. Second, stopping practice once you have experienced them, assuming you have arrived. The glimpses prove the destination exists, but do not constitute stable realization. Afterward, you return to ordinary consciousness, though changed by what you experienced. The challenge is integrating insight into daily life rather than chasing repeated peak experiences. Stage 6 is stabilization and service. After repeated cycles of expansion and contraction, glimpse and return, gradually the recognition of unity becomes more constant. You no longer need special conditions to remember your true nature. It remains accessible through ordinary activity. At this stage, Rumi argues, you become useful to others in new ways, not through teaching or preaching necessarily, but through your presence itself. The purified person becomes a mirror in which others glimpse their own divine nature. Your function shifts from personal development to serving the development of all beings. Rumi emphasizes this is not about becoming a perfect person who never makes mistakes or has negative emotions. The realized person still experiences the full range of human feeling, but is not tyrannized by emotion or identified with mental states. They serve from wholeness rather than trying to fill personal emptiness through helping others, which creates codependency disguised as compassion. The final stage Rumi describes is complete annihilation, followed by subsistence in God. The separate self-sense disappears entirely, yet paradoxically you continue functioning in the world. This is the most controversial and difficult stage to describe or verify. Does Rumi claim individual consciousness ends completely? Does it persist but transformed beyond recognition? The evidence suggests he means something like this. Imagine a wave that suddenly realizes it was always ocean, never separate. The waveform continues temporarily, you still have a body and particular perspective, But the identification with being only this wave dissolves irreversibly. You know yourself as the entire ocean playing as this particular wave pattern. Where does this developmental model fail practically? First, it is too linear. Actual spiritual development rarely proceeds through neat stages. People spiral, regress, skip stages, or find certain stages do not resonate with their temperament or culture. Rumi's map reflects his experience and context, but may not universalize as smoothly as implied. Second, the model underemphasizes psychological health as prerequisite for spiritual development. Modern research shows that people with untreated trauma or personality disorders can access altered states and mystical experiences, but cannot integrate them healthily. They may become more dissociated, not more integrated. Rumi lived before psychology as discipline existed, so he lacks frameworks for addressing these issues. Third, the emphasis on transcendence can devalue embodiment and worldly engagement. While Rumi celebrates the body in some passages, the overall arc moves from material to spiritual, form to formlessness, world to God. This risks creating practitioners who are spiritually experienced but relationally immature, emotionally avoidant, or socially irresponsible, using spirituality to escape rather than transform their humanity. Contemporary teachers attempting to apply Rumi's path must address these limitations explicitly. They often combine his insights with psychological therapy, trauma work, and social justice frameworks. The question is whether this represents legitimate evolution or dilution of Rumi's teaching. Traditionalists argue modern additions weaken the radical challenge of complete self-transcendence. Reformers counter that context requires adaptation, and psychological health enables rather than opposes spiritual realization. Part 4. The teacher-student relationship, shams, and the necessity of the guide. Perhaps no aspect of Rumi's philosophy generates more controversy than his teaching on the absolute necessity of a human spiritual guide. Modern Western readers, valuing individualism and suspecting authority, often skip over or minimize this dimension. But for Rumi, the teacher-student relationship is not optional enhancement. It is the essential mechanism through which transformation occurs. Rumi's reasoning proceeds from his metaphysics. If you are asleep, if you are identified with illusion, how can you wake yourself up from within the dream? Someone already awake must shake you, someone standing outside your particular sleep. The spiritual teacher functions like this, disrupting your comfortable unconsciousness, forcing you to see what you're avoiding. But the relationship is not like ordinary education, where the teacher possesses information the student lacks. Rumi describes it more like midwifery. The truth is already within you, but you cannot birth it alone. The teacher provides pressure, discomfort, skillful intervention that enables emergence. They wound your ego precisely where wounding is needed to crack you open. His experience with Shams of Tabriz exemplifies this radical teaching relationship. Shams was not conventionally qualified as a spiritual teacher. He had no position, no students, no established reputation. He was a wandering dervish known for being difficult, demanding, and uncompromising. Yet Rumi, already an accomplished scholar and teacher himself, immediately recognized Shams as his spiritual master. What Shams did to Rumi appears psychologically violent by contemporary standards. He insisted Rumi abandon his students, his teaching position, his scholarly work. He monopolized Rumi's time and attention. He demanded complete devotion and obedience. When Rumi's family and students resented this, Shams did not compromise but intensified his demands. He disappeared suddenly, forcing Rumi into devastating grief and longing. From outside, this looks like cult dynamics, one person exerting total control over another. Rumi argues it was precisely what he needed, someone willing to demolish his carefully constructed spiritual identity, his investment in being the respected teacher, his attachment to scholarly accomplishment. Only by losing everything he thought he was could he discover what he actually was. The philosophical justification rests on several pillars. First, Rumi argues the ego or false self is extraordinarily clever at co-opting spiritual practice for its own purposes. You can meditate for years while using meditation to reinforce your sense of being a spiritual person, more evolved than others. You can study sacred texts while accumulating knowledge as ego decoration. The teacher sees through these strategies because they are not invested in your self-image. Second, transformation requires feedback from someone further along the path. You cannot see your own blind spots. You rationalize your avoidance, justify your attachments, convince yourself that your current level represents the destination. The teacher disrupts these comfortable lies, but only if you have granted them authority to do so. Third, Rumi suggests the teacher-student relationship itself becomes the crucible for transformation. The specific teachings or practices matter less than your relationship with the person teaching them. Through loving the teacher, you learn how to love purely, because the teacher ideally represents divine reality in human form. Your neurosis, your defenses, your patterns all emerge in this relationship and can be addressed directly. This creates obvious dangers that Rumi acknowledges but does not adequately address. How do you distinguish a genuine spiritual teacher from a charlatan or abuser? If the test of a true teacher is that they make you uncomfortable and challenge your ego, then any abusive person could claim this justification. If you are supposed to surrender your judgment to the teacher, how do you retain the capacity to recognize when you are being exploited? Rumi offers several criteria for recognizing authentic teachers. They demonstrate genuine spiritual realization through their presence, not just their words. They have no personal agenda, seeking nothing from students for themselves. They display consistency between teaching and behavior. They point beyond themselves to God rather than making themselves the object of devotion. But these criteria are subjective and easily manipulated. Many spiritual abusers present compelling appearance of realization. They convince students that their demands serve spiritual purposes rather than personal gratification. They frame pointing beyond themselves while actually ensuring students remain dependent on them. Contemporary research on cultic groups and abusive spiritual teachers reveals patterns that would have been familiar in Rumi's time, but which he does not adequately guard against. Isolation from outside perspectives. Increasing demands for loyalty and obedience. Shaming or expelling students who question or resist. Sexual or financial exploitation justified through spiritual rationale. The question is whether Rumi's model of teacher authority is inherently prone to abuse, or whether it can be practiced safely with proper safeguards. Some modern teachers argue for what they call transparent authority, where the teacher maintains pedagogical position but not authoritarian control. They encourage students to question, maintain outside relationships and perspectives, and set clear boundaries around what they will and will not do. Traditional Sufis often reject this as diluting the teaching beyond effectiveness. They argue that genuine transformation requires precisely the kind of total commitment and surrender that makes contemporary people uncomfortable. The discomfort itself indicates you are approaching what needs to transform. Making the path safer makes it ineffective. The scholarly debate centers on whether Rumi intended his teaching about Shams to be universalized, or whether he was describing his particular path that others might follow differently. Some scholars emphasize passages where Rumi suggests multiple paths to God. Not everyone needs the same type of teacher or relationship. Others point to statements insisting that without a guide, you will wander lost forever, and the guide must be human, not just books or inner knowing. Practical application reveals the model's strengths and weaknesses clearly. Consider someone drawn to meditation but practicing alone from books and apps. They make progress initially, feel calmer, more centered, then they plateau. They notice their practice has become mechanical. They are no longer opening to deeper insight. Rumi would diagnose this as hitting the limit of what you can achieve alone. You need a teacher who can see where you are stuck and provide the specific intervention you need, which might be different from what you want or expect. The teacher might intensify practice when you want comfort, or relax standards when you're trying too hard, or challenge beliefs you have been avoiding. This works well when the teacher is genuinely skilled and ethical. The student progresses beyond what seemed possible alone. They integrate insights into daily life with guidance on navigating obstacles. The relationship becomes profoundly transformative. But when the teacher is unskilled or unethical, the model produces disaster. Students sacrifice personal autonomy, ignore legitimate needs, stay in harmful situations because they believe this is spiritual surrender. They normalize psychological or physical abuse as necessary purification. They cut off family and friends who express concern, viewing outside perspective as obstacle to their path. Rumi does discuss spiritual friendship as an alternative or supplement to formal teacher relationships. He suggests traveling with companions on the path, people at similar stages who support and challenge each other. This peer model reduces power imbalance, but may lose the benefit of relating to someone genuinely more realized than yourself. The deepest critique comes from democratic and egalitarian philosophical traditions that reject hierarchical authority in principle. They argue no human should surrender judgment to another, regardless of apparent spiritual advancement. Personal autonomy and rational evaluation must remain paramount even in spiritual contexts. Teacher and student should relate as equals, collaborating on the student's development, not master and disciple with absolute authority dynamic. Rumi would likely respond that this democratic model protects the ego it should be dissolving. The insistence on maintaining personal authority and judgment is precisely what prevents breakthrough to reality beyond the personal. You cannot think your way to selflessness while protecting your right to personal sovereignty. At some point you must leap beyond control, and having someone you trust to catch you makes that leap possible. The resolution might involve distinguishing between different types of spiritual authority and different stages of the path. Early-stage students may benefit from more structure and guidance. Advanced practitioners require less external authority as they have developed stable internal knowing. Different temperaments thrive under different teaching styles. Some need fierce challenge, while others respond better to gentle support. But Rumi shows limited interest in these nuances. His teaching on spiritual guidance remains absolutist, reflecting his experience with shams as singular and unrepeatable, but also universally necessary in some form. Modern students must adapt his insight to contemporary context or risk replicating outdated power structures inappropriate for our time. Part 5. Ecstatic States and Poetry as Knowledge, Experience over Scripture. Rumi makes an extraordinary epistemological claim that separates him from mainstream Islamic theology. He argues that direct mystical experience provides more reliable knowledge of God than scripture, tradition, or rational theology. This is not just a difference in emphasis. It is a radical reordering of authority that threatened religious establishments in his time and continues generating controversy today. The conventional Islamic epistemology places Quran as primary source, authenticated sayings of the Prophet Muhammad as secondary source, then consensus of scholars and analogical reasoning from established principles. Personal experience ranks lowest, needing constant verification against scriptural sources. Rumi inverts this hierarchy completely. His reasoning stems from the distinction between second-hand and first-hand knowledge. Reading about water does not quench thirst. Studying medical texts does not cure disease unless you apply the treatment. Similarly, reading scripture or theological descriptions of God provides only conceptual knowledge, not transformative encounter. Rumi uses the metaphor of grape juice versus wine. Scripture is like grape juice, valuable but not yet transformed. Mystical experience is wine, the juice fermented through practice and realization into something that intoxicates and changes consciousness. You cannot understand wine by studying grape juice. You must drink the wine itself. This leads to his controversial elevation of poetry over prose theological writing. Why does Rumi write in poetry rather than systematic philosophical argument? Because mystical knowledge resists logical analysis and literal description. Poetry communicates through metaphor, paradox, multiple meanings, rhythm that affects consciousness directly rather than conveying information to rational mind alone. When Rumi describes God as drunk, or the universe as God's tavern, or worshippers as moths burning themselves in the divine flame, he is not being decorative. He is using the only language capable of pointing toward experiences that transcend ordinary conceptual understanding. Prose analysis would falsify the content by forcing it into rational containers too small to hold it. The concrete mechanics of how poetry functions as knowledge transmission are subtle. Reading Rumi's verse, you encounter contradictions. God is simultaneously near and far, present and absent, within you and beyond you. These contradictions cannot be resolved logically. They must be held simultaneously until your rational mind gives up trying to make them coherent, and suddenly you glimpse what they are pointing toward, a reality that transcends binary logic. The rhythm and music of the poetry also matter. Rumi intended his work to be read aloud, chanted, sung, accompanied by music and movement in Sama ceremonies. The sound affects your nervous system, alters your consciousness through sonic means. This is why translation always loses something essential, not just meaning, but the vibrational effect of the original Persian. Rumi also describes ecstatic states themselves as direct knowledge. When consciousness shifts during deep meditation, or through whirling or spontaneously, you directly perceive reality differently. In these states, the separation between self and other dissolves experientially. You do not think about unity conceptually, you are unity without a separate self to think about it. These experiences are not hallucinations or delusions in Rumi's view, though conventional rationality dismisses them as such. They are actually more real than ordinary perception because they perceive what is truly there without the distorting filter of ego and conditioning. Normal consciousness is the dream, mystical states are waking up. This creates immediate problems for verification and communication. How do you confirm mystical experience is veridical, revealing true reality, rather than brain states producing compelling but false perceptions? Rumi's answer relies on several criteria. Does the experience produce lasting transformation in the person's character and behavior? Do multiple realized practitioners across traditions describe similar experiences? Does the knowledge gained prove itself through its fruits, making you more loving, more peaceful, more effective at serving others? But these criteria are insufficient for skeptics. Transformation could result from many causes, including placebo effects. Similar descriptions across traditions might reflect shared neurology producing similar brain states, not perception of objective spiritual reality. Beneficial outcomes do not prove truth. Many false beliefs produce positive effects if believed sincerely. The philosophical debate becomes whether knowledge requires third-person verification or whether some domains are inherently first-person and cannot be reduced to objective measurement. Rumi stands firmly in the first-person camp. You cannot prove God to someone who has not experienced God any more than you can prove colour to someone born blind. But this does not make the knowledge less valid, only incommunicable to those without the necessary experience. Critics point out this creates unfalsifiable claims. Any challenge can be dismissed by saying the critic lacks the experience to understand. This sounds suspiciously like special pleading, claiming your beliefs are exempt from normal standards of evidence because they occupy privileged territory. Rumi acknowledges the communication problem but offers no real solution except insisting you must taste to know. He compares it to trying to describe sexual pleasure to someone who has never experienced arousal. Words fail completely. The only option is encouraging them toward the experience itself. Where this epistemology succeeds is in motivating direct spiritual practice rather than endless theological speculation. If reading texts cannot provide real knowledge, you must practice meditation, cultivate presence, open yourself to direct encounter. This practical orientation prevents religion from becoming purely intellectual exercise or social performance. It also validates individual spiritual experience against religious authority that might try to control or suppress it. If your direct experience contradicts what scholars or scripture seem to say, Rumi suggests trusting the experience and reinterpreting the texts. This is deeply threatening to religious institutions relying on textual authority for their power. Where it fails is in providing no safeguards against delusion or exploitation. If direct experience trumps all other authority, how do you challenge someone having destructive experiences they claim are divine revelation? Throughout history, people have committed atrocities, believing they were following direct guidance from God. Some epistemological humility and external verification seems necessary. Rumi attempts to address this by emphasizing the teacher's role in validating and interpreting experiences. You report your mystical experiences to your guide, who has traveled farther and can distinguish genuine insight from ego fantasy. But this just shifts the problem. Now you need to verify the teacher's realization, which requires the same first-person knowledge you do not yet have. The practical application reveals both power and danger clearly. Someone new to meditation begins experiencing unusual states, perhaps feeling boundless love, or perceiving energy moving in their body, or sensing presence they interpret as divine. Rumi's framework validates these experiences as potentially real contact with spiritual reality, not just brain chemistry. This encouragement can motivate deeper practice and prevent premature dismissal of genuine insight as neurological noise. The person develops confidence in their own direct knowing, rather than remaining dependent on external authority forever. However, without proper guidance, they might also inflate early experiences into full realization, believing they have achieved in weeks what traditionally takes decades. They might develop spiritual narcissism, thinking their experiences make them special or superior. They might interpret every unusual feeling as divine communication and stop using critical thinking entirely. Contemporary teachers attempting to apply Rumi's epistemology often add psychological literacy to his framework. They teach students to distinguish between spiritual experience, psychological material surfacing during practice, and neurological phenomena like hypnagogia or hyperventilation effects. They emphasize integration rather than just accumulating altered states. This represents evolution beyond Rumi's medieval framework, which lacked psychological sophistication. The question is whether such additions preserve or dilute his core insight about direct experience as primary knowledge source. Scholars debate whether Rumi actually places experience entirely above Scripture or whether he maintains Scripture as essential framework for interpreting experience. Close reading suggests he moves between positions, sometimes celebrating mystical knowing beyond all texts, other times returning to Quranic interpretation to validate his insights. This may reflect his own uncertainty, or his attempt to avoid outright heresy while still pushing boundaries. The relationship between poetry and mystical experience also generates scholarly disagreement. Does Rumi write poetry about experiences he already had, using verse to describe pre-existing knowledge? Or does the poetic process itself generate mystical insight, the act of composition inducing altered states where new understanding emerges? Evidence supports both directions. Some poems clearly describe prior experiences, attempting to capture what already occurred. Others seem to discover their meaning through the writing itself, the poet entering ecstatic state during composition. This suggests reciprocal relationship where experience inspires poetry and poetry deepens experience in ongoing cycle. The ultimate question is whether Rumi's epistemology can function in modernity, where authority structures have collapsed and individual claims to direct divine knowledge have produced everything from profound wisdom to violent extremism. Perhaps his framework requires embedding in community and tradition that provides interpretive guidance. Or perhaps it represents dangerous individualism that we must reject in favour of more democratic and rationally grounded approaches to knowledge. Part 6. Social and Political Philosophy, Community, Power and Justice. Rumi is typically read as an apolitical mystic focused entirely on individual spiritual transformation. This reading is incomplete and misses his sophisticated, though often implicit, social and political philosophy. Embedded in his poetry and stories are specific claims about community organization, economic justice, political power, and social responsibility that deserve serious examination. His core political insight stems from his metaphysics. If all beings are divine manifestations, then hierarchy based on birth, ethnicity, gender, or wealth is arbitrary and false. True hierarchy reflects only spiritual realization, and even this is temporary, existing only from perspective of those still developing. From ultimate perspective, all are equally divine. This has radical implications Rumi does not fully develop, but which contemporary readers can extract. If conventional social hierarchies lack metaphysical ground, they are human constructions serving particular interests, usually the powerful. They can be challenged, dismantled, reorganized based on different principles. Rumi does not call for political revolution explicitly, but his metaphysics undermines traditional authority structures thoroughly. He tells numerous stories featuring slaves, beggars, and social outcasts who possess greater spiritual wisdom than kings and religious officials. These are not just heartwarming reversals, but systematic critique of power. The people society deems worthless or inferior often have clearer spiritual sight precisely because they have nothing to lose, no investment in maintaining illusions that benefit them materially. Conversely, Rumi portrays religious authorities and wealthy merchants as often spiritually blind despite their social position. Their power and comfort insulate them from truths that would threaten their position. They use religion to justify existing arrangements rather than genuinely seeking God. This is biting social criticism disguised as spiritual teaching. On economic questions, Rumi advocates what we might call spiritual communism. In the Mevlevi order he founded, members share resources, no one owns private property, all goods are held communally. This reflects his view that private ownership reinforces the illusion of separate existence. If everything is God's, nothing belongs to your individual self. However, he does not extend this communal economic model to society generally, only to the spiritual community. He seems to accept that ordinary society will have property, commerce, and economic hierarchy, while holding that those seriously pursuing spiritual realization must renounce such things. This creates two-tier system, one set of rules for spiritual practitioners, another for everyone else. The question is whether this represents failure of vision or pragmatic accommodation. Perhaps Rumi believes most people are not ready for communal economics, and imposing it would create suffering rather than liberation. Or perhaps he simply does not think through implications of his metaphysics for social organization beyond spiritual communities. On political power, Rumi's position is complex and somewhat contradictory. He counsels kings and rulers, suggesting he accepts their authority as legitimate. Yet his advice consistently emphasizes that true power is spiritual, not political, and rulers should see themselves as servants rather than masters. He warns that earthly power corrupts spiritual development unless exercised with extreme humility and awareness of its transience. He tells stories of rulers who lose everything, showing that political power provides no security or ultimate meaning. The wise ruler, in Rumi's view, governs lightly, intervenes minimally, and focuses more on personal spiritual development than expanding territory or enforcing laws. This sounds like Taoist Wu Wei, effortless action, transplanted into Islamic context. But he never quite calls for dismantling political power entirely or creates vision of anarchist spiritual community without rulers. This may reflect the danger of explicit political resistance under medieval sultanate, where heterodox views could result in execution. Or it may show limitation in his thinking, unable to imagine social organization radically different from what existed. On justice, Rumi emphasizes internal transformation over external enforcement. The just person acts justly not from fear of punishment or expectation of reward, but because they see all beings as themselves. You cannot harm another when you recognize that other as your own being in different form. This makes conventional legal systems unnecessary for the realized, though still needed for those living in illusion of separation. Critics point out this internalizing of justice can enable systemic oppression to continue unchallenged. If the solution to injustice is individual spiritual realization, not collective action to change structures, then existing power arrangements persist indefinitely. The oppressed are told to transform themselves spiritually rather than resist their oppression materially. Rumi does not quite fall into this trap completely. He tells stories praising those who challenge corrupt officials and unjust rulers. He validates anger at injustice as potentially sacred emotion when motivated by defense of the vulnerable. But he lacks systematic framework for distinguishing when resistance is necessary versus when acceptance and surrender is appropriate. On community organization, Rumi emphasizes organic development over rigid structure. The Mevlevi order he founded avoided complex hierarchies initially, organizing around practices like sama and communal dwelling rather than elaborate rule systems. This reflects his suspicion of legalism and external authority, believing community works best when members are bound by love and shared purpose rather than written regulations. However, after Rumi's death, the order did develop hierarchy, rules, and formal structures. This raises question whether his vision was workable long-term, or whether some structure inevitably emerges as community grows and faces practical challenges. Modern intentional communities struggle with same question: how to balance spontaneity and structure, individual freedom and collective coherence. Rumi's view of gender and social roles is thoroughly medieval, accepting most conventional arrangements of his time. Women have souls and can achieve spiritual realization equally with men, but social roles remain differentiated and hierarchical. He occasionally praises female mystics and includes women in his stories as spiritual teachers, but does not challenge patriarchal family structure or women's limited public roles. This represents clear limitation requiring critique. His metaphysics of universal divine unity should logically extend to gender equality in social practice, not just spiritual potential. That he fails to make this extension shows how even radical mystics remain embedded in their time's unquestioned assumptions. Contemporary applications of Rumi must explicitly reject his gender politics while preserving valuable insights. On religious pluralism, Rumi is surprisingly progressive for his era. He insists that different religious traditions are paths up the same mountain, valid for those following them sincerely. He includes stories of Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and others achieving spiritual realization through their own traditions. He suggests fighting over religious doctrine is spiritually immature, like children arguing about descriptions of candy rather than actually tasting it. However, scholars debate whether Rumi's pluralism is genuine acceptance of difference or concealed superiority, claiming all paths lead to his truth. Does he really honor Christianity on its own terms? Or does he interpret it through Islamic Sufi lens, finding it valuable only insofar as it approximates his view? This question matters because false pluralism that appears accepting while actually assimilating difference is common throughout religious history. Practical application of Rumi's social philosophy today faces multiple challenges. His emphasis on spiritual community resonates with people seeking alternatives to atomized individualism. Modern intentional communities and spiritual centers often draw on his vision of shared life, organized around practice and mutual support, rather than economic competition. But these communities frequently struggle with questions Rumi does not adequately address. How do you handle interpersonal conflict without rigid rules, but also without tolerating abuse? How do you make decisions collectively while honoring both wisdom of experienced members and voice of newer participants? How do you support members economically while maintaining communal orientation? His critique of materialism and status-seeking remains powerfully relevant. Consumer capitalism functions by keeping people identified with their separate self, constantly seeking fulfillment through acquisition and achievement. Rumi's insistence that only spiritual realization satisfies provides radical alternative, though one difficult to practice while embedded in economic systems demanding participation. His vision of justice, grounded in recognizing divine unity in all beings, could inform progressive politics today. Environmental protection follows naturally from seeing nature as divine manifestation, not resource for exploitation. Economic justice emerges from recognizing wealthy and poor as equally divine, challenging vast inequality. Criminal justice focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment aligns with seeing offenders as sacred beings, temporarily identified with destructive patterns. But translating mystical insight into effective political action remains challenging. Spiritual communities attempting to model alternative social arrangements often remain small and marginal. Scaling up requires structure and compromise that can dilute original vision. Rumi provides spiritual foundation for social transformation, but inadequate practical guidance for navigating complexity of implementing it broadly. Part 7. Death, Dissolution, and What Comes After. Rumi's teaching on death represents one of his most distinctive and least understood contributions. He does not offer conventional afterlife doctrine with heaven and hell as literal places where righteous and wicked go after bodily death. Instead, he presents death as ongoing process happening throughout life, culminating in physical death that is transition, not ending. His famous poem begins the Masnavi with celebration of death. He compares the human soul to a reed cut from the reed bed, longing to return. But what dies in death is not the person, but the illusion of separate personhood. What you think of as yourself, your identity, memories, preferences, all the psychological structure is temporary form that must dissolve so essential consciousness can recognize itself. This requires distinguishing between physical death, ego death, and ultimate dissolution. Physical death is body's cessation, the form you have identified with decomposing and returning to earth. Ego death is psychological structure dissolving while body still lives. What happens in deep meditation or mystical experience when the self-sense temporarily disappears. Ultimate dissolution is complete return to undifferentiated divine reality, with no trace of individuality remaining. Rumi argues you must die before you die. This means undergoing ego death while still physically alive so you can discover what remains when identity vanishes. If you wait until bodily death to discover this, you face the terror of dissolution unprepared. But if you practice dying throughout life through spiritual work, physical death becomes non-event, just another moment in ongoing transformation. The mechanics he describes work like this. Ego is constructed through identification with thoughts, feelings, memories, roles, relationships. I am a teacher, a parent, someone who likes this and dislikes that, someone with a history and future plans. All these are mental constructs, stories consciousness tells itself. They feel absolutely real, but through practice you can notice them as constructs and then release identification with them. When identification releases, what remains? Rumi's answer is pure awareness, or consciousness itself, not the contents of consciousness, but the knowing presence in which all contents appear. This awareness has no birth or death, it simply is. It is what you truly are, what you have always been. But identification with the ego story has obscured it. Physical death strips away the ego structure whether you are ready or not. The body can no longer maintain the patterns. The brain that generates thoughts and memories ceases functioning. If you have not already recognized your nature as awareness beyond these patterns, this dissolution is existentially terrifying. You feel like you are being annihilated because you think you are the patterns dissolving. But if you have practiced dying, if you have already let go of identification with thoughts and form, physical death is just continuation of what you have been practicing. You recognize that what you truly are cannot die because it was never born. It is eternal, not in the sense of lasting forever in time, but in the sense of being beyond time entirely. This sounds abstract, so let us make it concrete with a contemporary application. A person receives terminal diagnosis with months to live. Conventional approach focuses on physical comfort, legacy planning, saying goodbye to loved ones. These matter, but Rumi suggests something additional, using approaching death as ultimate spiritual practice opportunity. The diagnosis demolishes future orientation and forces radical presence. Plans that seemed important yesterday are suddenly meaningless. The person faces directly what everyone avoids, the certainty and immediacy of their dissolution. This can catalyze the surrender and letting go that people resist their entire lives. Rumi would encourage this person to see approaching death as grace, the universe forcing the spiritual work you could not do voluntarily. Rather than fighting it or distracting yourself, you turn toward it, consciously releasing attachment to all the things you will lose: your body, your identity, your relationships, your accomplishments. Through this release, you might discover what remains when everything else falls away. This practice is sometimes called conscious dying. Hospice workers and spiritual counselors trained in contemplative traditions help dying people work with their fear and attachment, not to eliminate them, but to move through them toward acceptance and peace. Research shows people who engage this process often experience profound shifts in the final weeks or days, reporting loss of fear, sense of peace, and sometimes mystical experiences of unity. Critics argue this romanticizes death and dying, which for many involves pain, confusion, fear, and indignity. Not everyone achieves peaceful acceptance. Some people suffer tremendously to the end. Suggesting they should find this spiritually meaningful risks, adding guilt to their suffering, implying they are failing spiritually if they cannot accept their death gracefully. Rumi's response, implicit in his work, is that difficulty of dying reflects how much letting go is required. If you have spent entire life building and defending your identity, it will not collapse easily or painlessly. The struggle itself is the process, and even difficult death can be spiritually transformative if you allow yourself to be broken by it, rather than resisting to the bitter end. But this still does not adequately address situations where cognitive decline prevents conscious engagement with dying. Someone with advanced dementia cannot practice conscious dissolution because their awareness itself has fragmented. Rumi's framework has limited applicability to these situations beyond encouraging caregivers to maintain loving presence. On the afterlife question, Rumi's position is nuanced and often misunderstood. He does not reject heaven and hell as concepts, but reinterprets them psychologically and spiritually rather than geographically. Heaven is experience of unity with God. Hell is experience of separation from God. Both occur now based on your consciousness state, and continue after death as consciousness transitions without body. Whether this transition involves individual consciousness persisting or dissolving completely into undifferentiated unity remains ambiguous in Rumi's work. Some passages suggest the purified soul maintains its individuality eternally, enjoying eternal relationship with God. Other passages describe complete dissolution where no trace of separate identity remains, the drop merging into ocean so completely that speaking of the drop afterward makes no sense. This ambiguity may be intentional, reflecting Rumi's sense that ultimate truth exceeds conceptual description. Or it may reflect genuine uncertainty, these questions exceeding what he can know through experience and requiring speculation he recognizes as inadequate. Scholarly debate focuses on whether Rumi's view is compatible with orthodox Islamic teaching on afterlife. Traditional doctrine describes bodily resurrection, literal heaven and hell, and individual souls experiencing reward or punishment based on earthly deeds. Rumi's psychological and mystical reinterpretation seems far from this literal reading. Some scholars argue Rumi preserves orthodox teaching while adding mystical layer. Both are true simultaneously. Others insist he fundamentally rejects literal interpretation while using traditional language to avoid persecution. The textual evidence supports both readings depending on which passages you emphasize. Where Rumi's death teaching succeeds is in reducing existential anxiety through practice rather than belief. You do not need to believe in particular afterlife scenario to benefit from practicing ego dissolution now. The practice itself provides direct experience of consciousness beyond psychological structure, which answers death anxiety through direct knowing rather than conceptual assurance. It also provides framework for grief that goes beyond just moving on or maintaining connection with the deceased. Rumi suggests those who die have dissolved more fully into divine reality than they manifested during life. Grief is appropriate. It reflects love and loss of their particular form. But ultimate perspective sees they have not gone somewhere else. They have returned to the source that we also are, just still wearing our own forms temporarily. Where it fails is in situations requiring concrete action rather than philosophical perspective. When someone is dying preventably from curable disease or violence, spiritual acceptance can become excuse for not providing treatment or stopping harm. Rumi's teaching works for inevitable death, not for death that should be prevented. Distinguishing these appropriately requires wisdom he does not clearly articulate. Part 8. Critique of Religious Orthodoxy. When piety becomes obstacle. Perhaps Rumi's most controversial dimension is his sustained critique of conventional religious practice and orthodoxy. He was himself deeply rooted in Islamic tradition, having received extensive religious education and teaching theology before his mystical awakening. Yet his mature work includes biting criticism of exactly the kind of piety he once embodied, arguing that conventional religious observance often blocks genuine spiritual realization. His critique operates on several levels. First, he challenges emphasis on external conformity over internal transformation. Praying 5 times daily, fasting during Ramadan, making pilgrimage to Mecca, these prescribed practices matter, in Rumi's view, only if they produce actual change in consciousness. Performed mechanically as social performance or identity marker, they are worse than useless. They are spiritual obstacle. He tells the story of a person who prays constantly but mistreats their family and cheats in business. Another person never prays formally but acts with consistent kindness and integrity. Rumi's conclusion is shocking to conventional believers. The non-prayer is closer to God than the prayer because they manifest divine qualities in action rather than just performing religious ritual. This is not simply saying both practice and ethics matter. Rumi goes farther, suggesting that religious practice without genuine transformation is spiritually harmful, worse than no practice at all. It creates what we might call spiritual materialism, using religion to reinforce ego identity as pious person rather than dissolving ego entirely. Second, he criticizes religious certainty and doctrinal rigidity. Those who are most certain they possess truth, who believe their interpretation of Scripture is definitively correct, are furthest from genuine knowing, in Rumi's view. True mystic remains in perpetual openness, willing to have all their understanding overturned by direct experience. The scholar who has memorized entire Quran but has never tasted divine presence knows nothing of real importance. This sets him at odds with institutional religious authority that relies on claiming definitive interpretation of doctrine. If direct experience exceeds and can contradict scriptural authority, then the ulama, the religious scholars, lose their power as gatekeepers. Rumi does not quite call for dismantling religious institutions, but certainly undermines their authority systematically. Third, he challenges the entire concept of religious law as sufficient spiritual path. Islamic Sharia, divine law, provides detailed guidance on every aspect of life, from prayer to commerce to family relations. Orthodox theology presents following Sharia as the path to salvation. Rumi suggests Sharia is at best preliminary stage, essential for beginners, but which must be transcended. His metaphor is that Sharia is like the body of religion, necessary but not sufficient. The Sufi path is like the soul of religion, animating the body and giving it meaning. Following rules without spiritual realization is like having a corpse. The form remains, but the life has departed. Yet pursuing spiritual experience while ignoring ethical life is equally incomplete, like trying to exist as soul without body. This creates complex relationship where Rumi neither fully accepts nor fully rejects religious law. He seems to say you must honor the forms while recognizing they are not the ultimate point. But in practice, he and his followers certainly violated many conventional expectations, particularly around music and dance, which conservative scholars viewed as impermissible innovation. The most dangerous aspect of his critique involves religious identity itself. Rumi famously says he is neither Christian nor Jew nor Muslim, not from any religion or tradition. He places himself beyond all religious categories, claiming identity only with the infinite divine reality. This appears to invalidate religious boundaries and exclusive truth claims entirely. Orthodox Muslims in his time and later condemned this as heresy, abandoning Islam. Rumi's defenders argue he is not rejecting Islam, but perfecting it by moving from exoteric outer form to esoteric inner truth. From his perspective, genuine Islam is submission to God, which means dissolution of all false identity, including religious identity that reinforces separation. But critics on all sides find this unsatisfying. Conservative Muslims accuse him of destroying Islam through relativistic mysticism that treats all religions as equal paths. Progressive universalists accuse him of using mysticism to avoid taking ethical stands that require choosing positions over others. If all perspectives are equally valid paths up the mountain, how do you condemn obviously harmful religious teachings and practices? Rumi's response, never fully articulated, seems to be that from absolute perspective all is divine manifestation, but from relative perspective discrimination and judgment remain necessary. You can honor all sincere spiritual seeking while still challenging teachings that produce harm. But he provides no clear methodology for making these distinctions. The practical implications generate ongoing controversy. Modern practitioners drawn to Rumi often take his critique as permission to ignore all religious form and tradition, creating personal spiritual practice from whatever appeals to them. This spiritual eclecticism or buffet approach picks pieces from multiple traditions without committing to any particular discipline. Rumi would likely critique this as another form of ego comfort, staying in charge of your spiritual life rather than surrendering to transformative practice. His critique is not that all religious forms are useless, but that they must be practiced with intention toward actual transformation. Picking only comfortable pieces from various traditions while avoiding their challenging aspects defeats the purpose. Traditional practitioners, meanwhile, often ignore Rumi's critique and domesticate him back into Orthodox Islam, treating his poetry as beautiful decoration on conventional teaching rather than radical challenge to it. This removes the offence, but also removes the power. Comfortable Rumi, who simply reinforces existing beliefs, is not the dangerous mystic who disrupted religious establishments of his time. Where his critique succeeds is in exposing spiritual materialism and ego's capacity to co-opt religious practice for its own purposes. Contemporary research in psychology of religion confirms that people frequently use religion to enhance self-esteem, justify their biases, and establish superior identity rather than genuinely transforming. Rumi saw this 800 years ago and called it out clearly. His insistence that genuine spirituality produces concrete changes in character rather than just belief or practice remains powerfully relevant. You can evaluate spiritual teachings and practitioners by their fruits, how they actually treat others and live their lives. This provides grounded criterion when mystical experiences and doctrinal claims can be manufactured or self-deceived. Where his critique fails is in fully addressing how religious tradition and community enable rather than just obstruct spiritual development. While Rumi challenges rigid orthodoxy, he himself remained embedded in Islamic tradition and Sufi lineage. He never pursued completely individual path independent of tradition. Yet his rhetoric sometimes implies such independence is possible or even preferable. The question becomes whether spiritual transformation requires both honouring tradition and critiquing it simultaneously, or whether at some point genuine realization requires leaving tradition behind entirely. Rumi's life suggests the former, but his poetry sometimes implies the latter. This unresolved tension allows diverse groups to claim him, each emphasizing different aspects. Part 9. The Problem of Suffering and Evil. Rumi's Theodicy. The problem of evil has plagued theology for millennia. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does suffering exist? Rumi's response to this question, his theodicy, flows directly from his metaphysics, but creates as many problems as it solves. His answer is simultaneously profound and potentially dangerous, capable of producing either liberation or spiritual bypassing, depending on how it is understood. The foundation of his theodicy is radical acceptance that evil and suffering are necessary aspects of divine manifestation. Without darkness, light has no meaning. Without pain, pleasure cannot be recognized. Without evil, good cannot exist as category. This is not merely philosophical abstraction. Rumi claims this reflects metaphysical necessity. God cannot create a world containing only one polarity. Duality is intrinsic to manifestation itself. He uses the metaphor of a carpet viewed from above versus below. From underneath, you see only chaos, tangled threads in apparently random patterns. From above, the same threads form beautiful, coherent design. Human perspective is like viewing from beneath. We see only our limited slice of reality. From divine perspective, viewing the whole simultaneously, what appears as evil and suffering is actually necessary element of perfect pattern. This immediately creates the problem of perspective. If we only understood the whole picture, we would see that everything is actually perfect, including genocide, child abuse, terminal illness, and all forms of cruelty and suffering. This sounds like justification for accepting and even celebrating evil, which is morally repugnant. Rumi is aware of this problem, but his solutions remain unsatisfying to many critics. His first clarification is that evil is real within the level of manifestation, within the dream of separation. You cannot and should not dismiss someone's suffering as unreal. When a child starves, that suffering is absolutely real to the child and to everyone who loves them. Rumi insists on honouring the reality of pain while simultaneously holding a larger perspective. The mechanics work through understanding different levels of reality. At the empirical level, the level of lived experience, evil is genuinely evil and must be addressed, alleviated, prevented. At the metaphysical level, the level of ultimate reality, only God exists manifesting as all things, including what we experience as evil. Both perspectives are valid, and spiritual maturity involves holding them simultaneously without collapsing one into the other. A concrete example clarifies this. A physician treating victims of violence sees the suffering as absolutely real and works tirelessly to heal and prevent further harm. This is the appropriate response at the empirical level, full engagement with alleviating suffering. Simultaneously, through spiritual practice, the physician might recognize that perpetrator, victim, herself, and the violence itself are all temporary forms taken by single divine reality. This metaphysical recognition does not reduce effort to help, but prevents the physician from becoming overwhelmed by despair or hardened by constant exposure to harm. Rumi suggests that evil serves several functions within divine economy. First, it provides the friction necessary for spiritual growth. Without obstacles, challenges and suffering, consciousness would remain dormant, never awakening to question existence and seek deeper truth. Your greatest spiritual advances typically follow your worst suffering, not your most comfortable periods. Second, evil reveals character and develops virtue. Courage cannot exist without danger. Compassion requires suffering to address. Patience needs frustration to practice against. The virtues we value most highly require their opposites to manifest. Remove all evil, and you remove the conditions that allow goodness to emerge and be recognized. Third, and most controversially, evil serves as divine play or exploration. If God is infinite and eternal, unchanging and perfect, how does God experience novelty, growth, drama, resolution? Only through manifestation as finite beings who do not know the whole picture and can therefore experience genuine surprise, loss, triumph, and transformation. From this view, the universe is God's way of having experiences impossible from the position of infinite unity. This theodicy produces fierce debates among scholars and practitioners. Some find it philosophically elegant, resolving the problem of evil by reframing it as necessary aspect of existence rather than flaw requiring explanation. Others condemn it as morally bankrupt, treating real human suffering as cosmic entertainment or spiritual education rather than genuine tragedy requiring prevention. The feminist theologian Wendy Farley critiques theodicies like Rumi's for what she calls aestheticizing suffering. They make suffering beautiful or meaningful from a distance perspective while ignoring the visceral horror experienced by actual sufferers. A mother watching her child die of cancer is not helped by being told this is part of a perfect pattern she cannot see, or that suffering enables spiritual growth. Such explanations add insult to injury, suggesting the mother should find meaning in unbearable loss. Rumi's response, implicit in his poetry, is that theodicy is not meant for those currently suffering, but for those tempted toward existential despair about the nature of reality. When you are in acute pain, you need help and comfort, not philosophical explanation. But when you step back and ask whether existence itself is fundamentally good or evil, whether life is worth living given the amount of suffering it contains, then theodicy becomes relevant. He also addresses the question of why God does not simply prevent evil if God is all-powerful. His answer involves the distinction between possibility and actuality. God could create a world without evil, but such a world would lack the specific qualities that make existence meaningful to conscious beings. It would be static, unchanging, without drama or development. The choice is not between this world and a better world with less evil, but between this world with its mix of good and evil versus no manifest world at all. Critics point out this still makes God responsible for choosing to create a world containing evil rather than choosing not to create at all. If I choose to have a child knowing they will suffer terribly, my choice to create them is morally questionable, even if I do not directly cause their suffering. Applying this logic to God makes divine creation itself ethically problematic. The practical application reveals both the power and danger of Rumi's theodicy clearly. Someone experiencing chronic illness or disability might encounter Rumi's framework suggesting their suffering serves spiritual purpose, either burning away karma, developing their soul, or providing opportunity for others to practice compassion. For some people, in some contexts, this framework transforms unbearable suffering into meaningful challenge. The illness remains difficult, but it is no longer pointless arbitrary cruelty. It becomes part of a larger story where they are protagonists undergoing necessary transformation. Research in meaning-making after trauma shows that people who construct coherent narratives about their suffering generally cope better than those who experience it as meaningless. But for others, this framework produces toxic positivity and self-blame. They feel pressure to find meaning and accept their suffering gracefully when what they actually need is to rage against it, grieve it, or seek every possible means to alleviate it. The suggestion that suffering serves spiritual purpose can prevent people from appropriate responses like leaving abusive situations, seeking medical treatment, or demanding social change to address systemic causes of suffering. Rumi does provide one crucial nuance that contemporary interpreters often miss. He distinguishes between necessary suffering that comes from being finite and contingent and unnecessary suffering that comes from ego and resistance. Physical pain from injury, grief from loss, difficulty of growth, these are intrinsic to existence. But much human suffering results from clinging to what must change, identifying with what is impermanent, or fighting against reality rather than accepting it. This second category of suffering can be reduced or eliminated through spiritual practice without changing external circumstances. You cannot prevent experiencing loss, but you can transform your relationship with loss so it does not destroy you. You cannot avoid physical pain, but you can change how you relate to pain so you are not tortured by your resistance to it. The contemporary physician Gabor Mate describes how people suffering chronic pain often experience pain about their pain, the secondary suffering that comes from hating and fighting the sensation itself. When they learn to accept the raw sensation without the narrative of how terrible it is and how it should not be happening, often the suffering reduces dramatically even though the pain remains. This validates Rumi's distinction between unavoidable and self-created suffering. Where Rumi's theodicy succeeds most powerfully is in preventing despair when confronting the full scope of suffering in existence. If you take seriously the amount of pain, cruelty and tragedy throughout history and across the world, it is difficult to avoid concluding that existence is fundamentally malevolent or meaningless. Rumi provides a framework that acknowledges this suffering fully while maintaining that existence itself is sacred and ultimately benevolent. Where it fails most catastrophically is when used to justify evil or discourage action against it. Throughout history, mystical acceptance of suffering as divine will has enabled quietism, the view that we should not resist or try to change anything because all is perfect as it is. This has permitted atrocities to continue while spiritual people observe with detached equanimity, telling victims their suffering serves higher purpose. Rumi himself seems torn between these positions. Some passages celebrate fierce action against injustice, validating rage at cruelty and wrongdoing. Other passages counsel complete acceptance of whatever arises, trusting divine wisdom beyond human understanding. He never adequately explains when each response is appropriate. The question of animal suffering presents particular challenge for Rumi's theodicy. If suffering enables spiritual growth, what purpose does the suffering of animals serve? They are not developing virtue or awakening to reality through their pain. The deer killed slowly by predators, the dolphin trapped in fishing nets, the billions of animals raised in factory farms, their suffering seems to serve no purpose even within Rumi's framework. Rumi lived in a time when animals were largely invisible in moral consideration, so he does not address this directly. Contemporary interpreters extending his thought argue that animal suffering is part of the same cosmic pattern, all consciousness eventually evolving toward recognition of unity, regardless of current form. But this feels like retrofitting rather than genuine resolution of the problem. The ultimate question is whether any theodicy can be satisfying. Perhaps the problem of evil is inherently unsolvable from within existence, requiring acceptance that reality contains genuine ambiguity and tragedy that cannot be explained away. Rumi's contribution is providing a framework that takes suffering seriously while preventing it from destroying faith in the fundamental goodness of existence. Whether this represents deep wisdom or sophisticated self-deception remains disputed. Part 10. Gender, Sexuality and the Feminine Divine. Rumi's views on gender and sexuality are deeply contradictory, reflecting the patriarchal assumptions of 13th-century Islamic society, while simultaneously containing surprising moments of gender transcendence and celebration of the feminine divine. This makes interpretation and contemporary application particularly fraught. The most obvious dimension is his acceptance of standard gender hierarchy. Women have distinct social roles centered on family and domestic life. Men occupy public space, pursue scholarship and spiritual teaching, exercise political power. Rumi rarely questions these arrangements explicitly, taking them as natural order rather than social construction. However, his poetry and stories include numerous female characters who are spiritually advanced, sometimes more so than their male counterparts. He tells stories of women saints who perform miracles, women who see through religious hypocrisy that fools male scholars, women whose devotion exceeds that of famous male mystics. This suggests he recognizes spiritual capacity as independent of gender, even while accepting social gender restrictions. The famous story of Rabia al-Adawiyya appears in his work multiple times. She was an 8th-century female Sufi saint who rejected marriage proposals to devote herself entirely to God. When asked whether she loved God or hated Satan more, she replied that her love for God left no room to think about Satan. Rumi presents her as exemplar of pure devotion, superior to male mystics of her time. This creates space for women's spiritual authority within traditional structures, but does not challenge those structures themselves. Women can be saints and mystics, but still should not teach publicly, lead prayers, or exercise institutional authority. Rumi never advocates for women's equal participation in religious or social leadership. His treatment of sexuality is similarly complex. Sexual desire and pleasure appear frequently in his poetry, sometimes literally describing physical intimacy, sometimes metaphorically representing soul's union with God. The boundary between literal and metaphorical is deliberately blurred, creating poetry that functions on multiple levels simultaneously. Orthodox interpretations insist all sexual imagery in Sufi poetry is purely metaphorical, representing spiritual states rather than actual physicality. This reading allows the poetry to remain respectable and devotional. More recent scholarship argues Rumi genuinely celebrates physical sexuality as manifestation of divine creative energy, not as something to transcend, but as something to integrate into spiritual life. The evidence supports both readings depending on which poems you emphasize. Some clearly use sexual imagery metaphorically, describing union with the divine beloved in erotic terms that cannot be literal. Others seem to describe actual physical intimacy as sacred act, divine energy expressing itself through bodies in union. His relationship with Shams of Tabriz adds another layer of complexity. The intensity of devotion Rumi expresses toward Shams, the obsessive quality of their connection, and the poetry describing union with the beloved led some modern scholars to interpret this as homosexual relationship. Traditional interpreters vehemently reject this reading, insisting the relationship was purely spiritual mentorship. The debate is unresolvable given available evidence, and reflects contemporary concerns projected onto historical figures who lived before modern categories of sexual orientation existed. What is clear is that Rumi experienced profound intimacy with Shams that transcended conventional friendship and conventional teacher-student relationships. Whether this intimacy included physical sexuality is unknown and perhaps misses the point. More important is how Rumi's poetry has been appropriated by contemporary LGBTQ spiritual seekers, finding in his celebration of same-sex intimacy, however interpreted, validation for their own relationships. Traditional religious authorities condemn this appropriation as misreading, while progressive interpreters celebrate Rumi as ahead of his time in recognizing love's validity regardless of gender. Rumi's treatment of the feminine divine represents perhaps his most interesting dimension regarding gender. Islamic theology presents Allah with both masculine and feminine attributes. 99 divine names that include merciful, beautiful, patient, gentle, traditionally coded feminine, alongside powerful, majestic, dominant, coded masculine. Rumi emphasizes the feminine attributes, particularly divine beauty and mercy, more than many Islamic thinkers of his time. He also uses feminine imagery for God and soul extensively. God is bride, beloved woman whose veil the seeker longs to lift. The soul is feminine, she who receives divine masculine in ecstatic union. This differs from traditions where God is exclusively masculine and soul is bride. However, feminist scholars note that even when the feminine divine appears in Rumi's work, it is often as object of male desire rather than subject of her own experience. The beloved is mysterious, withdrawing, testing the lover through absence, essentially passive, while the masculine lover pursues actively. This reproduces problematic gender dynamics even while celebrating the feminine. Some passages do transcend this, presenting the divine feminine as active creative force. The universe emerges from divine womb. God mothers creation into being. These images honor feminine as powerful generative principle, not just beautiful object of contemplation. The question of gender transcendence or dissolution is central to understanding Rumi's ultimate view. At highest levels of realization, he suggests gender distinctions dissolve along with all other categories. The realized being is neither male nor female, or equally both, having transcended identification with gendered form. In union with God, the soul sheds all limiting identities, including gender. This can be read as liberating, suggesting spiritual realization frees people from restrictive gender roles and expectations. Or it can be read as problematic erasure, insisting people must transcend their gendered experience to achieve realization rather than realizing themselves fully as gendered beings. Contemporary feminist theology generally argues for embodied spirituality that honors rather than transcends gender. Women's experience as women provides unique spiritual insights that should be valued, not overcome. Similarly, LGBTQ spiritual approaches often emphasize integrating rather than transcending gender and sexual identity. Rumi's transcendent model can seem to devalue these identities as ultimately unreal obstacles to overcome. Practical application reveals the tensions clearly. A contemporary woman, drawn to Rumi, finds inspiration in his female mystics and celebration of divine feminine. She uses his poetry to deepen her spiritual practice and finds herself opening to profound states of union and presence. This empowers her spiritual life and validates her capacity for direct realization. But she also encounters passages assuming women's inferiority or using feminine imagery in ways that objectify rather than honor women. She must decide whether to accept Rumi as a flawed product of his time, whose essential insights remain valuable, or reject him for failing to challenge patriarchy adequately. Similarly, a gay man finds in Rumi's poetry language for the spiritual depth of his relationship with his partner. The beloved and lover imagery resonates with his experience of devotion that is simultaneously physical and spiritual. Rumi's work validates that his love contains a sacred dimension beyond mere physical attraction or conventional romance. But traditional Sufis and many Muslims insist Rumi would condemn homosexual relationships as sinful, and that interpreting his poetry as validating them is gross distortion. The gay reader must navigate claiming Rumi for himself versus respecting how Rumi's tradition interprets him. Scholarly debates rage about whether we should interpret historical figures through their own context or through contemporary values. Traditionalists insist we must understand Rumi as 13th-century Muslim scholar who accepted orthodox views on gender and sexuality, even if he pushed boundaries in some respects. Progressives argue that his essential insight about divine unity, transcending all categories, logically extends to gender and sexuality equality, even if he did not make that extension himself. The question is whether we can separate the transformative core of Rumi's teaching from the limiting cultural assumptions in which it was embedded. Can you practice Rumi's path while rejecting his gender assumptions? Or are those assumptions so integral to his worldview that removing them distorts everything? Where Rumi succeeds regarding gender is in demonstrating that spiritual realization is not the exclusive domain of men. Women can and do achieve the highest states of consciousness. Female spiritual authority has validity even in patriarchal society. This was genuinely progressive for his context, even if insufficient by contemporary standards. Where he fails is in not extending his radical insight about the illusory nature of all categories to critique the social construction of gender hierarchy itself. If all separation is illusion, if all beings are equally divine, then gender-based restrictions on women's participation in religious and social life are unjustifiable. That Rumi does not see this reveals the limits of even mystics to transcend their cultural conditioning completely. The ultimate question is whether contemporary practitioners should try to recover a gender-egalitarian Rumi from his texts, create a new Rumi updated for contemporary values while acknowledging this involves creative interpretation, or honestly present his views as limited while extracting what remains valuable. Each approach has adherents, and each involves trade-offs between historical accuracy and contemporary relevance. Part 11. Historical Influence: How Rumi Shaped Islamic and World Thought. Rumi's impact on Islamic civilization and eventually world thought is difficult to overstate. Yet this influence is uneven, profound in some domains while barely registering in others, and often involves creative misreading as much as accurate transmission. Understanding how his ideas propagated requires tracing multiple threads through centuries of intellectual and cultural history. Within Islamic world, Rumi's immediate influence centered on the Mevlevi order he founded. After his death in 1273, his son Sultan Valad organized his followers into formal structure that became one of the major Sufi orders. The Mevlevi order spread throughout Ottoman Empire, establishing lodges in major cities where members practiced sama, the whirling meditation, studied Rumi's writings, and developed the traditions that continue today. The order gained political influence as Sufi lodges often did in Islamic societies, serving as centers of education, social welfare, and sometimes political power. Ottoman sultans patronized the Mevlevis, attended sama ceremonies, and sought blessing and counsel from Mevlevi sheikhs. This gave Rumi's teaching institutional power to shape Islamic practice beyond just mystical circles. However, his influence on mainstream Islamic theology and jurisprudence remained limited and controversial. Orthodox scholars continuously debated whether his metaphysics were compatible with Quranic monotheism. The doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, unity of existence, faced repeated condemnation as heretical by ulama, who saw it as pantheism incompatible with God's transcendence. Some scholars wanted Rumi's works banned, while others defended him as expressing orthodox teaching in poetic language requiring proper interpretation. This tension meant Rumi's ideas influenced Islamic mysticism profoundly, but Islamic law and theology only tangentially. Sufi orders throughout the Islamic world studied his Masnavi as spiritual textbook, calling it the Quran in Persian. But legal scholars and systematic theologians engaged his thought minimally or critically. His poetry influenced Persian and Turkish literature massively. Every subsequent Persian poet worked in Rumi's shadow, either emulating or reacting against his style and themes. The entire tradition of mystical love poetry in Persian develops largely from Rumi's innovations, his use of everyday life as metaphor for divine relationship, his willingness to shock with unconventional imagery, his celebration of intoxication and madness as spiritual states. Outside the Islamic world, Rumi remained virtually unknown in the West until the 19th century. A few Orientalist scholars studied him as part of cataloguing Persian literature, but he did not penetrate Western consciousness significantly. This changed gradually through the 20th century as Western interest in Eastern spirituality increased. The key transmission moment came through translations. Early English translations by Reynold Nicholson in the early 1900s made Rumi accessible to English readers for the first time, though Nicholson's scholarly literal style limited popular appeal. The breakthrough came with Coleman Barks's translations beginning in the 1970s, which popularized Rumi enormously in America and beyond. Barks created free adaptations rather than precise translations, working from literal versions by Persian scholars and recreating the poems in accessible contemporary American English. His Rumi emphasized universal spiritual themes while de-emphasizing Islamic specifics, creating poetry that resonated with spiritual but not religious seekers. This approach made Rumi the best-selling poet in America by the 1990s, an extraordinary achievement for a 13th-century Islamic mystic. However, scholars of Persian literature criticize Barks's translations as distortions that remove Rumi from his Islamic context and create a New Age version bearing limited resemblance to the original. They argue Barks strips out Quranic references, Islamic theology, and cultural specificity, leaving generic spirituality that Americans find comfortable, but that falsifies Rumi's actual thought. The debate reflects larger questions about translation philosophy. Should translation prioritize literal accuracy or effective communication in the target language? Barks argues his goal is creating poetry that functions in English the way Rumi's functioned in Persian, which requires freedom to adapt rather than word-for-word rendering. Critics counter that this freedom becomes license to remake Rumi into whatever contemporary readers want him to be. Regardless of this debate, Barks's Rumi influenced millions of Western readers. Self-help authors, yoga teachers, spiritual coaches, and New Age practitioners quote Rumi constantly. His poems appear on greeting cards, in weddings, in motivational speeches. He has become cultural touchstone for people seeking spiritual meaning outside traditional religion. This popularization created what scholars call the pop Rumi phenomenon, which we will examine more in the next part. But the influence extends beyond just popular spirituality. Psychologists have drawn on Rumi's insights about ego dissolution and consciousness transformation. Poets across languages cite him as influence on their work. Interfaith dialogue uses Rumi as example of mysticism, transcending religious boundaries. His influence on progressive Islam and Islamic reform movements is complex. Some Muslim reformers embrace Rumi as representing Islam's mystical heart, offering alternative to legalistic and political interpretations that dominate contemporary discourse. They point to his tolerance, his celebration of love over law, his transcendence of sectarian division as model for revitalizing Islamic thought. Conservative Muslims often reject this appropriation, arguing Rumi is being distorted to serve progressive agenda just as much as Western translators distort him for New Age purposes. They insist genuine Rumi affirmed orthodox Islamic practice and never intended his mysticism to replace rather than supplement Sharia. This tension plays out in contemporary Turkey, where Rumi's tomb in Konya is major pilgrimage site and tourist attraction. Secular Turks claim him as symbol of Turkey's pre-Ottoman cultural heritage and open spiritual tradition. Religious Turks claim him as Islamic saint, whose teachings support their vision of pious society. Each group emphasizes different aspects of his legacy to support their political and cultural agenda. His influence on Western philosophy has been limited but growing. Perennialist philosophers like Aldous Huxley and Houston Smith drew on Rumi to support their view that all religions share mystical core. Process philosophers and panentheists find in Rumi's metaphysics resources for thinking about God's relationship to world. Phenomenologists interested in altered states of consciousness study Sufi practices, including those Rumi described. Contemporary interest in contemplative practice and mindfulness has created new appreciation for Rumi's practical teachings. His descriptions of meditation, presence and ego dissolution resonate with people practicing Buddhist vipassana, Christian contemplation or secular mindfulness. This creates interesting syncretism, where Rumi's Islamic mysticism informs practices drawing on multiple traditions. The influence on music and performing arts has been substantial globally. The Mevlevi whirling ceremony has become UNESCO World Heritage cultural practice, performed as both devotional ritual and artistic presentation. Musicians across genres, from classical to electronic, have composed pieces inspired by Rumi or set his poetry to music. Contemporary dance frequently draws on whirling and Sufi movement practices. Where Rumi's historical influence succeeds most is in demonstrating that Islamic civilization produced profound mystical and philosophical thought that speaks beyond its original context. He challenges stereotypes of Islam as solely legalistic or militant religion by showcasing its rich interior dimensions. He provides resources for dialogue across religious and cultural boundaries through emphasizing universal human experiences of seeking meaning and transcendence. Where his influence becomes problematic is when appropriated so thoroughly by non-Islamic contexts that his Islamic identity disappears. This represents a form of cultural colonization, where the West takes what it finds useful from Islamic civilization while rejecting the religion itself. Muslims often feel Rumi is being stolen from them, his Islamic dimensions erased to make him palatable to people who would reject an explicitly Muslim teacher. The question becomes whether Rumi's ideas can travel across cultures and be adapted to new contexts while still honoring their origins, or whether such adaptation inevitably becomes distortion and appropriation that harms the source community. This debate applies beyond Rumi to all cultural exchange and translation, but becomes particularly fraught given power imbalances between Western and Islamic worlds. His influence continues evolving in the 21st century as new translations appear, scholars produce more nuanced interpretations, and diverse communities claim him for various purposes. The struggle to understand and transmit Rumi authentically while making him relevant to contemporary concerns defines much of the current engagement with his legacy. Part 12. Modern Misinterpretations, the Pop Rumi Problem. Perhaps no historical spiritual teacher has been as thoroughly sanitized, simplified, and misrepresented in popular culture as Rumi. The pop Rumi that circulates on social media, in self-help books, and at yoga studios bears limited resemblance to the actual 13th century Islamic mystic and his complex, often challenging philosophy. Understanding these distortions matters not just for historical accuracy, but for grappling with questions of cultural appropriation, spiritual bypassing, and what happens when radical ideas get domesticated for mass consumption. The primary misrepresentation involves decontextualizing Rumi's poetry from Islamic framework. Most popular English versions remove all Quranic references, mentions of Muhammad, Islamic practices, and theological terminology. What remains is generic spirituality about love, soul, and universe that could come from any tradition or no tradition at all. This makes Rumi palatable to people uncomfortable with Islamic religion, but interested in spirituality, which is large market in contemporary West. The Iranian-American scholar Omid Safi has documented this thoroughly. He shows how popular translations systematically erase Rumi's Islamic identity, turning him into spiritual but not religious poet rather than devout Muslim mystic. For example, where Rumi writes explicitly about Muhammad as perfect human being and supreme beloved, popular versions replace this with generic beloved that readers can interpret however they wish. Where Rumi discusses Islamic practices like prayer and fasting, popular versions omit these passages or reframe them as universal spiritual principles divorced from specific religious context. This creates Rumi who affirms what Western spiritual seekers already believe rather than challenging them with ideas foreign to their assumptions. The actual Rumi insisted on importance of teacher, criticized religious hypocrisy, demanded ego death through difficulty and suffering, and embedded everything in Islamic theology and practice. Pop Rumi offers comfortable affirmation, tells you your soul is already perfect, celebrates love without specifying what love requires, and makes spirituality seem easy and pleasant. The concrete mechanics of distortion work through several processes. First, selective quotation pulls individual lines from longer poems that qualify or complicate them. The famous line, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field, I will meet you there," circulates constantly as suggesting ethical relativism or transcendence of moral judgment. But in context, Rumi is describing a state of consciousness beyond duality that still acknowledges right and wrong at relative level, not dismissing ethics entirely. Second, mistranslation or creative adaptation changes meaning substantially. Coleman Barks, whose translations made Rumi hugely popular, worked from literal translations by Persian scholars and created free English versions prioritizing poetic impact over precision. While this produces beautiful poetry, it also introduces interpretations and emphasis not present in original. Barks admits he is not Persian scholar and aims to create American poetry inspired by Rumi rather than academic translation, but many readers assume they are encountering Rumi directly. Third, recirculation through social media and popular culture strips away even the minimal context most translations provide. A Rumi quote appears on Instagram with pretty background image, no source, no explanation, completely divorced from anything that would help understand it properly. It becomes an empty container into which readers pour their own meanings and assumptions. The result is Rumi as perpetual cheerleader for contemporary individualism and therapeutic culture. He supposedly tells you to follow your bliss, trust your feelings, let go of toxic relationships, and love yourself first. These may be valuable messages in certain contexts, but they are not particularly Rumi's teaching. Actual Rumi insisted on submitting to spiritual teacher, challenged trusting your feelings when they come from ego, demanded staying in difficult relationships as spiritual practice, and taught that self-love, as ordinarily understood, is the main obstacle to realization. Pop Rumi also becomes prophet of romantic love as ultimate spiritual path. Countless wedding ceremonies feature Rumi poems presented as celebrating romantic partnership as highest form of human connection. While Rumi certainly used love between humans as metaphor for divine love, his actual teaching insisted that human relationships must become transparent to divine reality rather than ends in themselves. He would likely challenge the idea that finding your soulmate is life's ultimate purpose, which Pop Rumi seems to endorse constantly. The phenomenon reflects a broader pattern of spiritual bypassing in contemporary Western culture. People use spiritual ideas to avoid dealing with psychological issues, systemic injustice, or difficult emotions. Pop Rumi enables this by suggesting you can transcend problems through positive thinking and spiritual awareness rather than addressing root causes through therapy, political action, or difficult interpersonal work. Actual Rumi taught that spiritual transformation requires facing your shadow, engaging difficulty fully and often feeling worse before feeling better as defense mechanisms crumble. Pop Rumi suggests spirituality should make you feel good, and any teaching that produces discomfort is probably wrong. The cultural appropriation dimension is significant and contested. Muslims, particularly those from Persian and Turkish backgrounds who claim Rumi as part of their heritage, often feel their tradition is being stolen and whitewashed. At the same time, many Muslims visit Rumi's tomb, practice in Mevlevi tradition, and study his work. Western spiritual seekers quote sanitized versions with no acknowledgement of Islamic context or debt to Muslim scholars who preserved and transmitted his work for centuries. Some argue this is inevitable and even positive, that good ideas should spread beyond their origins and be adapted to new contexts. Universal wisdom belongs to everyone, not just the culture that produced it. Others counter that this perpetuates colonial pattern, where West extracts what it values from other cultures while rejecting those cultures themselves. People love Rumi but fear and demonize Muslims, which represents profound hypocrisy and injustice. The economic dimension matters too. Publishers, translators, self-help authors, and spiritual teachers profit substantially from Rumi, while Persian and Muslim scholars who did the difficult work of translation, interpretation, and preservation receive minimal recognition or compensation. Coleman Barks became wealthy and famous through his Rumi adaptations, while the Iranian scholars who provided literal translations he worked from remain largely unknown. Defenders of popular Rumi argue that reaching millions of people with inspiring poetry, even if simplified, creates more good than insisting on scholarly accuracy that few would engage. If strict fidelity to Rumi's Islamic context means most Westerners would never encounter his ideas, perhaps simplified, accessible versions serve important purpose despite their limitations. The perfect can be enemy of the good, and intellectual purity can prevent practical benefit. Critics respond that false Rumi is worse than no Rumi. People think they understand Rumi when actually they have encountered distorted version that reinforces their existing assumptions rather than challenging them. This creates false confidence and prevents genuine engagement with ideas that could actually transform their lives and perspectives. Better to read nothing than to read something false that inoculates you against the real teaching. Practical impact of pop Rumi phenomenon is mixed. Millions of people have been moved by quotes and poems attributed to Rumi, finding comfort, inspiration, and encouragement. For some, this is gateway to deeper engagement with Sufism, Islamic mysticism, or contemplative practice generally. They start with accessible versions, then pursue more authentic understanding. For others, pop Rumi becomes substitute for genuine spiritual practice, providing pleasant ideas to think about without demanding actual transformation. They collect quotes, feel spiritually sophisticated, but never undertake the difficult work of ego dissolution, surrender to teacher, or confronting their own limitations that actual Rumi insisted on. The question is whether popular culture can transmit authentic spiritual teaching at all, or whether mass commodification inevitably distorts beyond recognition. Perhaps we need both scholarly accurate versions for serious students and simplified accessible versions for general public, as long as distinction between them is clearly marked. Currently, that distinction is rarely made, and most people encountering Rumi have no idea they are getting thoroughly mediated and interpreted version rather than direct access to his thought. Where pop Rumi succeeds despite distortions is in keeping conversation about spirituality, meaning and transcendence alive in secular culture. Even superficial engagement with these questions is better than pure materialism and consumerism that otherwise dominate. If sanitized Rumi helps people consider that there might be more to existence than what immediately appears, that serves a valuable purpose even if it is not what actual Rumi taught. Where it fails completely is in perpetuating power dynamics that erase Muslim voices and contributions while profiting from Islamic intellectual heritage. This is not just about Rumi, but about larger pattern of how Western culture relates to Islamic civilization, taking what seems valuable while rejecting the people and tradition that created it. Until this structural injustice is acknowledged and addressed, even well-intentioned popularization of Rumi participates in cultural violence. Part 13. Major scholarly debates and academic controversies. Academic study of Rumi involves fierce ongoing debates about fundamental questions of interpretation, context, influence, and significance. These scholarly controversies matter beyond academic circles because they shape how Rumi is understood, taught, and appropriated in contemporary culture. Understanding the contested terrain helps navigate the competing claims about who Rumi was and what he taught. The first major debate centers on Rumi's orthodoxy. Was he a faithful Muslim mystic working within Islamic tradition, or a heterodox heretic whose mysticism fundamentally contradicted mainstream Islam? Traditional Muslim scholars argue Rumi never left Islamic orthodoxy. His mystical experiences and poetic expression remained grounded in Quranic revelation and prophetic tradition. They read his controversial statements as metaphorical or representing temporary states rather than permanent theological positions. Academic scholars of Sufism often take a different view. They point to Rumi's clear articulation of Wahdat al-Wujud and his statements placing direct experience above scriptural authority as incompatible with orthodox theology. His insistence that religious forms are merely preliminary stages to transcend, and his apparent universalism, treating all religions as equally valid paths, seem to contradict exclusive truth claims central to traditional Islam. The debate turns partly on how we define orthodoxy. If orthodoxy means adherence to Quranic teaching and prophetic example, then many of Rumi's positions appear heterodox. But if we recognize that Islamic tradition has always contained mystical dimension, where apparent contradictions with exoteric teaching are accepted as representing higher esoteric truth, then Rumi fits within established pattern of Sufi teaching. Evidence exists for both positions. Rumi quotes Quran extensively, defends Muhammad as perfect model, and insists his mysticism fulfills rather than replaces Islamic law. Yet he also says things like being neither Muslim nor Christian, criticizes scholars who prioritize law over direct experience, and suggests ultimate truth transcends any particular religious formulation. Perhaps both are true. He remained committed to Islamic framework while pushing its boundaries to breaking point. The second major debate concerns Rumi's relationship to Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi, who died when Rumi was young, was the systematic philosopher of Sufism, who articulated Wahdat al-Wujud in detail. Scholars disagree about how much Rumi was influenced by Ibn Arabi versus developing similar ideas independently or being influenced by common Sufi intellectual culture. Some scholars argue Rumi knew Ibn Arabi's work well and deliberately chose poetic rather than philosophical form to express similar metaphysics. Others contend Rumi had minimal direct knowledge of Ibn Arabi, and their similarities reflect shared participation in broader Sufi tradition rather than direct influence. This matters because it affects whether we read Rumi as systematic philosopher presenting Ibn Arabi's ideas poetically, or as independent thinker whose poetic approach represents different epistemology altogether. The textual evidence is ambiguous. Rumi rarely cites Ibn Arabi explicitly, but his metaphysical framework clearly overlaps with Ibn Arabi's system. Whether this represents direct borrowing, common source, or independent discovery of similar truths through mystical experience remains disputed. Third, scholars debate Rumi's relationship to Shams of Tabriz and what actually happened in that transformative encounter. Traditional hagiography presents Shams as realized master who recognized Rumi's potential and guided him to enlightenment through their intense relationship. Skeptical historians suggest the relationship might have been more complex, possibly including psychological manipulation or sexual dimensions that traditional accounts suppress. The mystery of Shams's disappearance fuels speculation. Did he leave voluntarily, sensing his work with Rumi was complete? Was he driven away by Rumi's jealous students and family? Was he murdered, possibly with Rumi's son's involvement? Each interpretation implies different things about the nature of spiritual teacher-student relationships and what Rumi's subsequent behavior and poetry reveal about his character and teaching. We lack definitive historical evidence, leaving scholars to read between lines of Rumi's poetry and later accounts that may be legendary rather than factual. What is undeniable is that Shams's influence on Rumi was total and permanent, transforming him from conventional scholar to ecstatic mystic poet. Fourth, debates rage about Rumi's politics and social views. Progressive scholars emphasize passages suggesting social critique, challenge to hierarchy, and proto-democratic sensibilities. Conservative scholars argue Rumi accepted and supported traditional social arrangements of his time, and any apparent progressivism reflects modern projection rather than historical reality. The evidence allows multiple readings because Rumi's teaching operates on multiple levels. He can simultaneously affirm that all beings are equally divine manifestations while accepting social hierarchies as appropriate for people at different stages of spiritual development. He can criticize corrupt rulers while still counseling obedience to political authority. These apparent contradictions might be genuine complexity or might be strategic ambiguity, allowing him to avoid persecution while hinting at more radical positions. Fifth, scholars argue about the relationship between Rumi's Persian cultural context and his Islamic religious identity. Is he primarily Persian poet who happens to work within Islamic framework, or primarily Muslim mystic who happens to write in Persian? This debate has contemporary political dimensions as Iranian nationalists claim Rumi as Persian cultural heritage distinct from Arab Islam, while Muslims emphasize his Islamic identity above his ethnic or linguistic context. Historically, Persian and Islamic identities were thoroughly intertwined in Rumi's world, making modern attempts to separate them somewhat anachronistic. But the question matters for how we understand Rumi's significance and who has legitimate claim to his legacy. Sixth, scholars debate the extent of Greek philosophical influence on Rumi through intermediaries. Islamic philosophy incorporated substantial Greek thought, particularly Plato and Aristotle, via Arabic translations and commentaries. Some scholars argue Rumi's metaphysics shows clear Platonic influences, his distinction between manifest world and divine reality echoing Plato's forms. Others insist his thought derives primarily from Quranic and Sufi sources with minimal Greek influence. Seventh, feminist scholars debate whether Rumi's occasional elevation of feminine divine represents genuine insight or patriarchal appropriation of the feminine for male mystical purposes. Is his celebration of the feminine divine progressive or problematic? Does his use of gender in mystical poetry reinforce or subvert patriarchal assumptions? These questions lack clear answers, but shape how contemporary feminists engage or reject Rumi's work. Eighth, debates continue about Rumi's stance on other religions. Was he genuinely pluralistic, accepting validity of multiple paths, or a universalist who saw all religions as approximations of Islamic truth? Did he honour difference or subsume it into his own framework? This matters enormously for interfaith dialogue and whether Rumi provides resources for authentic religious pluralism or represents sophisticated form of Islamic triumphalism. Ninth, scholars argue about the role of music, poetry and altered states in Rumi's epistemology. Are these central to his teaching method or supplementary aesthetic dimensions? Can you understand and practice Rumi's path without engaging poetic and musical dimensions, or are they essential rather than optional? This affects whether Rumi's thought can be extracted and systematized philosophically, or whether it resists such treatment inherently. Tenth, ongoing debate concerns whether Rumi's teaching is primarily psychological, describing transformation of individual consciousness, or cosmological, making claims about ultimate nature of reality. Is he describing subjective experiences that feel transcendent or providing knowledge of objective metaphysical truth? This methodological question underlies many more specific interpretive disputes. These debates will not resolve definitively because evidence is limited and ambiguous. Rumi left poetic and narrative works that deliberately resist systematic interpretation, allowing multiple readings. His historical context is recovered imperfectly from sources written decades or centuries after his death, and contemporary scholars bring their own assumptions and agendas, inevitably shaping interpretation. What matters is recognizing that scholarly consensus does not exist on fundamental questions about who Rumi was and what he taught. Claims to definitive understanding should be viewed skeptically, and engagement with Rumi requires navigating contested terrain where multiple legitimate interpretations coexist. Part 14. Practical Applications. What actually works in real life. After examining Rumi's philosophy comprehensively, the crucial question remains, what from his teaching actually works when applied to contemporary life? This requires distinguishing between what sounds inspiring and what produces measurable transformation, between ideas that function in 13th century context versus what translates to 21st century situations. The most immediately applicable dimension is his teaching on presence and awareness. Rumi's insistence on bringing full attention to the present moment rather than living in memory and anticipation aligns with contemporary mindfulness research. Neuroscience confirms that present-centered awareness reduces stress, improves emotional regulation, and enhances well-being. Rumi provides poetic language and metaphysical framework that can motivate this practice more effectively than clinical instructions. Concrete application looks like this. Someone struggling with anxiety about the future uses Rumi's teaching that only this moment truly exists. Past and future are mental constructs. Anxiety lives entirely in imagination about what might happen. By repeatedly returning attention to direct sensory experience now, breathing, sounds, bodily sensations, the anxiety loses its grip. This is basic mindfulness practice, but Rumi's framework gives it deeper meaning. You are not just managing anxiety, but recognizing your true nature as timeless awareness, rather than the anxious thoughts appearing in awareness. This works consistently when practiced regularly. Research shows 8 weeks of mindfulness practice produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. Rumi helps people understand why this practice matters and sustain motivation through difficulty. However, it fails when used as spiritual bypassing to avoid addressing practical life problems. Someone with legitimate financial crisis cannot meditate it away by focusing on the present moment. They need to address the crisis through practical action while maintaining presence, not instead of it. Rumi's teaching can enable harmful avoidance if misapplied. His teaching on emotional honesty and feeling fully applies powerfully. Contemporary therapy emphasizes sitting with difficult emotions rather than avoiding or suppressing them. Rumi anticipated this by centuries, insisting you must descend into grief, anger and fear rather than transcending them prematurely. The guesthouse poem, where all emotions are welcomed as divine visitors, has helped countless people develop healthier relationship with their emotional life. Practically, someone experiencing intense grief after loss can use Rumi's framework to stop judging themselves for not moving on fast enough. The grief is not problem to solve, but experience to inhabit fully, trusting it will transform in its own time. This approach aligns with modern grief therapy and produces better outcomes than suppression or forced positive thinking. But it fails if someone has untreated trauma requiring professional intervention. Some emotions are too overwhelming to sit with alone without psychological support and stabilization techniques. Rumi's framework assumes a functional ego that can bear intense feeling, which trauma sometimes damages. Insisting that someone with PTSD just feel their fear fully can re-traumatize rather than heal. His critique of ego and identification with thought remains powerfully relevant. Cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and many contemporary psychological approaches work with noticing thoughts as mental events rather than truth. Rumi provides contemplative framework for this that goes deeper than clinical psychology, suggesting you are not the thinker at all, but the awareness in which thinking appears. Someone trapped in negative self-talk can use Rumi's teaching to recognize these thoughts as conditioned patterns, not ultimate truth about themselves. Instead of fighting the thoughts or believing them, they learn to observe them arising and passing like weather, while their essential nature remains untouched. This creates distance from compulsive thinking that produces genuine relief. However, this teaching becomes problematic when used to dismiss all thought as illusion. Rational thinking serves essential functions. Analysis and planning remain necessary for navigating life successfully. The goal is not eliminating thought, but not being tyrannized by it, which requires discernment about when to engage thinking and when to rest in awareness beyond thought. Rumi sometimes suggests thought is always obstacle, which oversimplifies. His teaching on community and spiritual friendship applies valuably in our isolated culture. Contemporary research shows loneliness as serious health risk, and depth of connection matters more than number of relationships. Rumi's emphasis on finding companions on the path, people who support and challenge your spiritual development, points toward intentional community that many people crave. Practically, people form meditation groups, study circles, or spiritual friendships deliberately structured around mutual growth rather than just socializing. These relationships provide accountability, reflection, and shared practice that accelerates development impossible alone. The model works when relationships remain egalitarian and members share commitment to honesty and growth. It fails when it reproduces cultic dynamics with unequal power and charismatic leaders exploiting vulnerable seekers. Rumi's emphasis on total surrender to teacher has enabled abuse too often to ignore this danger. Contemporary applications must include clear boundaries, consent-based relationships, and respect for personal autonomy that Rumi's medieval framework lacked. His teaching on death and impermanence provides practical benefit for end-of-life care and grief work. Hospice workers report that people who practice conscious dying, using approaching death as spiritual practice, often achieve remarkable peace and even report transcendent experiences in final days. Rumi's poetry and framework give language for this process that medical terminology cannot provide. Someone receiving terminal diagnosis can use Rumi's teaching that death is transition rather than ending, that what you truly are cannot die. This does not eliminate grief and fear, but provides context that makes them bearable. The practice involves consciously releasing attachment to body, identity, and accomplishments, discovering what remains when everything else is stripped away. But this works only for people cognitively intact enough to engage the practice. Those with dementia or sudden traumatic death cannot practice conscious dying. And the framework can create pressure on dying people to have profound spiritual experience when maybe they just feel frightened and want comfort, not transformation. His critique of materialism and status-seeking remains painfully relevant in consumer culture. People recognize their accumulation of possessions and achievements does not provide lasting satisfaction, yet feel trapped in systems demanding endless striving. Rumi validates the intuition that something is fundamentally wrong with organizing life around material gain and social status. Practically, people use Rumi's teaching to make different choices about career, consumption, and success. They pursue work that feels meaningful over maximum income, simplify their lives, invest in relationships and experiences over things. This countercultural approach often produces greater well-being despite lower material standard of living. However, this teaching can enable privileged people to opt out of economic responsibility or judge those struggling financially as too attached to material life. Someone with financial security can afford to emphasize spiritual over material concerns in ways impossible for people in poverty. Rumi's critique of materialism must be applied with awareness of economic privilege and systemic inequality. His emphasis on beauty, poetry, and art as spiritual practice applies powerfully for creative people. Making art becomes meditation. Creative flow becomes altered state accessing deeper consciousness. Many artists report that engaging their creative process connects them with something transcendent, exactly what Rumi describes. Practically, someone develops regular artistic practice not primarily to produce saleable work, but as spiritual discipline. Writing, painting, music, dance become vehicles for presence and self-transcendence. This approach to creativity reduces performance anxiety and produces more authentic work. It fails if romanticized to the point where artists neglect practical development of craft. Spiritual inspiration alone does not produce excellent art. Skill requires dedicated practice and learning from tradition. Rumi was master of Persian poetic forms before he could transcend them, a fact contemporary artists sometimes forget. His teaching on love as transformative force applies most complexly. Deep, committed relationship certainly can catalyze profound growth, forcing you to confront ego patterns and develop capacity for intimacy, vulnerability, and surrender. Rumi provides framework for understanding relationship as spiritual practice, rather than just source of happiness and fulfillment. Practically, couples use Rumi's teaching to work with relationship difficulty as opportunity for growth, rather than reason to leave. They recognize conflict as revealing where they remain defended and separate, invitation to deeper intimacy. This approach strengthens relationships when both partners share commitment to growth. But it becomes dangerous when used to justify staying in abusive or fundamentally incompatible relationships. Not all relationship difficulty is spiritual growth opportunity. Sometimes people are wrong for each other, and separating is healthy choice. Distinguishing between productive challenge and destructive toxicity requires wisdom. Rumi does not adequately provide. The overall assessment is that Rumi's practical teachings work best when integrated with contemporary psychology, adjusted for cultural differences, and applied with discernment about context. His insights into consciousness, presence, ego, and transformation remain valuable, but his medieval social assumptions and lack of psychological sophistication require supplementing with modern understanding. The wisdom is real but not complete, powerful but needing careful adaptation. Part 15. Final synthesis and critical assessment, the complete picture. After this comprehensive examination, what can we conclude about Rumi's philosophy, its value, its limitations, and its relevance for contemporary life? This requires honest assessment that neither dismisses him as outdated nor accepts him uncritically, but recognizes both profound insights and significant failures. Rumi's central insight about the unity of existence remains philosophically and experientially powerful. The idea that apparent separation between self and other, between individual and divine, is perceptual illusion rather than metaphysical reality, continues generating productive philosophical and spiritual work. Whether this represents true metaphysics or useful model remains debatable, but its practical and experiential dimensions are well established. Mystical experiences across cultures and throughout history report dissolution of boundaries and recognition of fundamental unity, exactly what Rumi describes. However, his metaphysics creates genuine problems he never adequately resolves. The question of evil and suffering, the status of individual consciousness, the relationship between absolute and relative truth, these remain philosophically problematic within his framework. He provides poetic gestures toward resolution, but not rigorous philosophical arguments. Perhaps this reflects the limits of what can be systematized about mystical insight, or perhaps it represents incomplete thinking on his part. His epistemological claim that direct experience supersedes scriptural and rational authority contains important truth. Second-hand knowledge genuinely differs from direct knowing, and religious traditions do risk becoming empty ritual, divorced from living realization. Rumi's insistence on practice over belief, transformation over doctrine, challenges institutional religion in ways that remain necessary and valuable. Yet his epistemology lacks adequate safeguards against delusion and provides no clear methodology for verifying claims to spiritual realization. In practice, communities following his teaching have sometimes descended into authoritarianism, abuse, and collective self-deception. Exactly what better epistemological frameworks might prevent. Contemporary applications must supplement his emphasis on direct experience with other ways of knowing, including rational analysis, empirical investigation, and intersubjective verification. His teaching on love as fundamental force and path to realization captures something experientially real and philosophically interesting. Love, in Rumi's sense, the drive toward unity and recognition of fundamental interconnection, does seem to operate as central human motivation and provide access to transcendent states. His poetry communicating this remains unsurpassed in beauty and power. But his romanticism of suffering in love and emphasis on complete surrender creates genuine dangers, particularly for vulnerable people in unequal relationships. His medieval framework for teacher-student and gender relationships cannot be applied directly to contemporary contexts without enabling abuse. The transformative potential of love he describes is real, but so are the pathological forms love takes, and distinguishing them requires psychological sophistication. Rumi lacked. His developmental model mapping stages of spiritual transformation provides useful framework that aligns surprisingly well with contemporary research on adult development and consciousness studies. The progression from awakening to seeking to ego confrontation, to glimpses of unity, to stable realization describes a real process. Many practitioners report. However, the model is too linear and prescriptive, not accounting for diverse paths and temperaments. It also underemphasizes psychological health as foundation, assuming functional ego that can withstand ego death practices. Many contemporary seekers require therapeutic work before or alongside spiritual practice, something Rumi's framework does not address. His critique of religious orthodoxy and institutional authority remains powerfully relevant. The tendency of religious establishments to prioritize control over genuine transformation, to mistake performance for realization, to use spirituality for ego enhancement, these problems persist today. Rumi's challenge to conventional piety serves as necessary corrective. Yet his alternative of direct experience and teacher authority has its own problems, as we have discussed. We need neither uncritical acceptance of institutional authority nor naive celebration of individual experience, but frameworks honoring both individual spiritual knowing and collective wisdom of tradition, while maintaining critical perspective on both. His social and political philosophy represents the area of greatest limitation. His acceptance of patriarchy, social hierarchy, and political authority shows the limits of even mystical consciousness to transcend cultural conditioning completely. His insights about universal human dignity and divine nature of all beings do not translate into advocacy for social equality and justice in concrete terms. Contemporary applications must explicitly extend his metaphysical egalitarianism into social and political egalitarianism he failed to articulate. This is not distorting Rumi, but completing implications of his thought he could not see from within his historical context. His treatment of gender and sexuality requires similar critical extension. His occasional elevation of the feminine divine and validation of women's spiritual capacity are valuable starting points, but his patriarchal assumptions remain unacceptable. Modern practitioners must reconstruct his framework in explicitly feminist and queer-affirming directions, recognizing this as evolution beyond, rather than simple recovery of his teaching. The pop Rumi phenomenon reveals how powerful ideas get domesticated and distorted through popularization. While making Rumi accessible to millions, popular versions strip away the challenge and radical nature of his actual teaching, creating comfortable affirmation rather than transformation. Yet, completely rejecting popularization in favor of scholarly purity would mean most people never encounter these ideas at all. The solution involves clearer labeling and more honest acknowledgement of what is being presented. Popular adaptations should explicitly identify themselves as such rather than claiming to represent Rumi directly. Multiple access points to his work should exist simultaneously, from scholarly translations to creative adaptations, with readers understanding what they are getting. His historical influence demonstrates that Islamic civilization produced profound mystical philosophy, speaking to universal human concerns across time and culture. This challenges stereotypes of Islam as monolithically legalistic or anti-mystical. Rumi provides resources for interfaith dialogue and recognition of common ground beneath doctrinal differences. However, appropriating Rumi while rejecting Islam or Muslims perpetuates harmful patterns of cultural colonization. Honoring his contribution requires honoring the tradition that shaped him and the communities that preserved his work. This means engaging Islam seriously, not cherry-picking from Islamic mysticism while dismissing Islamic religion. The scholarly debates about Rumi's orthodoxy, influences and intentions will continue productively because they reflect genuine complexity and ambiguity in his work and context. Rather than seeking definitive interpretation, we should embrace multiplicity of valid readings while maintaining commitment to historical accuracy and philosophical rigor. For contemporary practitioners, the question is how to extract what remains valuable while honestly acknowledging limitations and adapting appropriately. This requires both deep study of Rumi in context and creative reconstruction for new contexts. Neither purely traditional nor purely modern, but synthetic approach honoring both. The final assessment is that Rumi offers genuinely transformative teaching about consciousness, love, presence, and ultimate reality embedded in poetry of extraordinary beauty and power. His insights remain relevant and applicable 800 years later, which demonstrates their depth and universality. At the same time, his framework is incomplete, reflecting medieval Islamic context with assumptions we must challenge and revise. He is neither perfect master whose every word should be accepted uncritically, nor outdated figure whose ideas can be dismissed as culturally bound and superseded. He is complex human being who achieved profound realization and articulated it brilliantly while remaining limited by his time, place, and psychological makeup. Engaging Rumi authentically requires intellectual honesty, cultural sensitivity, spiritual openness, and critical discernment. We honor him best not through blind devotion or complete rejection, but through serious engagement that takes both his wisdom and his limitations seriously. This allows his teaching to continue evolving and remaining relevant while maintaining connection to its source. The ultimate value of studying Rumi comprehensively is not just understanding one historical figure, but confronting fundamental questions about human existence, consciousness, meaning, love, and transcendence that remain as urgent today as in the 13th century. His specific answers may require revision, but the questions he grappled with and the depth of his engagement with them continue instructing and inspiring all who encounter his work seriously. In a world torn by religious conflict, materialistic emptiness, environmental crisis, and existential confusion, Rumi offers vision of underlying unity, sacredness of all existence, possibility of transformation, and primacy of love over fear and separation. Whether this vision represents ultimate truth or useful fiction, engaging it seriously expands consciousness and enriches life. That is accomplishment enough for any philosopher, poet, or spiritual teacher across the centuries.